Well, welcome everybody. This is our annual Homeowner Association workshop. It's one of my favorite workshops. I'm Kurt Wolford, the Director of the Stormwater Management Commission. Thank you for being here in person, and also everyone that's on the Zoom call, welcome as well. We do have some housekeeping items I'd like to just read through real quick. This is a hybrid event. So we do have some dedicated Q&A sessions, and we normally would have questions from the audience, and then Shireen over here, this is Shireen, she'll be watching the chat and answer questions from the chat as well. The workshop is being recorded for later distribution from SMC social media channels. For the in-person attendees, please help yourself to refreshments. We have snacks, coffee, and juice. Vendor Expo, if you were able to check out the vendors on the first floor, these are consultants and companies that are qualified and proficient in handling homeowner subdivision drainage, native vegetation, erosion control, a lot of the things that we deal with. Restrooms are right out the door to the right. There's a men's and women's bathroom and a drinking fountain. And if you're downstairs visiting the vendors, the same thing on the far right side, the bathrooms are down there as well. Please be aware that there are microphones around the room. We have these in-ceiling microphones, so it is picking up the audio. It'll pick up other sounds too. Zoom attendees, for all you virtual attendees, please keep your microphone on mute and your video off. And please feel free to enter questions into the chat. Shireen will be there to help address those questions. We appreciate your feedback about this workshop. We put on a lot of different education and information. We want to hear from the public. What else did we not cover? What else would you like to hear? So we do this every year. We look forward every year to these events. Shireen has a link you'll be putting in for feedback for the virtual attendees to provide feedback. If you're in person, we have these comment cards that you can fill out and let us know you enjoyed it, you didn't like it. They actually have these little faces on the back, so if you're just angry, you can circle that. That's what you're feeling today. We do want to get your feedback. We do have an excellent agenda this evening with 5 sessions. And then, like I said, we have dedicated Q&A after each session. We would appreciate it if we can get through each session and then hold off on questions till the end of each of those 5 presentations. You're in the central permit facility, and anybody had a problem getting here or get lost or drive around the roundabout a few times? Good. Glad everyone made it. We are in this facility that has a lot of best management practices that I would like to share with you. If you look out the window here to the right, this is our green roof. And this green roof is vegetated. It helps thermally cool the building. It also soaks up rainwater. It filters pollutants. And it's actually nice to look at. We've got benches out there. So being out in nature and seeing nature, it does have a mental health quality that I'm sure a lot of us do appreciate. If you go to our website, and this is what I'm going to show on the screen here, go to SMC's homepage, look us up on Google, find our webpage. Lake County Communications, I want to give a shout out. They've updated the county's websites to make it more adaptive and everyone can use it. So it looks a lot nicer, and we've tried to organize things for anyone. If you want to know about SMC, we've got information. If you're applying for permits, many of our staff are a regulatory group. We issue permits. Landowners, we've got a section on that that's helpful information for landowners. Local governments, we work in partnership with many units of government from federal, state, local, and even HOAs. HOAs are a smaller local, I wouldn't say government, but they have infrastructure, and you have infrastructure, and you're wanting to learn about your infrastructure and what funding is available. So we do work with homeowners associations as well. And some other good information on our website, but a couple items I did want to point out is on About Us, if you check out the Central Permanent Facility BMPs, this link here, that will launch into our building here. And we've got these little QR codes on these informational displays around all our best management practices. So you can scan that QR code and watch a video and learn about the best management practices. Here's all the videos. This first video is not great, don't watch it. But green roof, you'll hear more about the green roof. We got rain gardens out front when you pulled in. That's a large rain garden out front. Native plant swales, wetland detention basins, bioswales. And we were able to leverage an IEPA 319 water quality grant to help pay for all these BMPs. Because the county said, no, if you want to put in all this nice stuff, go find money. But we did. So money is out there and it's available. And we've been pretty successful, not only for ourselves, but working with units of government, working with HOAs to bring in funding to do these types of best management practices. The other link I wanted to share is under the homeowners best practices. So for landowners, there's a homeowners best practice link. So if you check that one out, here we got our HOA workshop. That's what we're all here for tonight. But there's additional information down here for bioswales, disconnecting your downspouts. Instead of letting all that drainage go right into the storm sewers, let it infiltrate, let it filter through the lawns. Phosphorus, that's an issue that we're trying to address across the whole county. It's actually a national issue. Rain barrels, Swalco's here tonight, so introducing Walter and Swalco staff. They have the rain barrel sales. It's always a great event. Dog waste management. I have 2 dogs. Get those little bags you can bring. Clean up after your pets. Urban tree canopy. Trees are very important. Trees help reduce runoff, and more trees are better. And so there's a lot of good information out here. So I wanted to point those out. But welcome to this event. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you for the staff that made this event possible. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first presentation. This is going to be by 2 of the most qualified technical experts in the county. I don't know who's number 1 and number 2, but Julie walked up here first. So I'll say Julie Crane is our principal wetland specialist with the Stormwater Management Commission, and then Alana Bartoloy with the Lake County Health Department and she's the Ecological Services Program Coordinator. And we know Alana because whenever we get the calls about algae, algae is a hot topic. So Alana's the algae person. But with that, thank you for attending. Please fill out your comment cards and take it away, Julie.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I am so glad to see everyone here. I just want to say that it's been a while since I've been up in front doing a presentation, and usually I've got a screen here, so we're going to give it a go without the screen here. That being said, over the years, the Lake County Stormwater Management Commission, and I'm sure the Health Department, has received queries from folks about maintaining their stormwater facilities. And tonight, Alana and I are going to touch on a number of things like the who, what, where, when, how, and why of stormwater facility maintenance. Now, let's be clear, these are things that individually could take entire sessions on their own. And tonight, we've got 15 to 20 minutes. So we are not going to be able to do a deep dive into any of these topics. But with that said, let's get started with the who. Of course, it gets complicated right away because the question of who is twofold. First, you have the who is responsible for the facilities, and then there's the who should do the maintenance work. Let's start with the responsible who. All right, what we know is that when a site is being developed, the permittee is responsible for managing and maintaining the stormwater systems until the regulatory agencies issue a final approval. And usually as part of that final approval, there is a responsibility to transfer that management and maintenance role to a long-term management maintenance party or parties. And so you're sitting there going, Julie, that's great, but that still doesn't answer the question, who's responsible? And you're right. There are a lot of options, as you can see here. A good rule of thumb is that the property owner is the responsible party, but there are exceptions. Sometimes it's based on, from one community to another, that may differ. Or even from one stormwater facility type to another, that may be a different answer. So where does that leave us? That's a good question. There is actually a key document called an operation and maintenance plan that hopefully has been something that's available to every association. It would have been a document that was developed as part of the subdivision permitting process that should identify responsible parties for the various stormwater facilities. And we'll talk about that later. Maybe it's got a different name. Maybe it's a long-term management plan. Maybe it's a management and maintenance plan. So that covers this first who. Let's talk about the second who. This second who is the who to hire. So maybe this is a hire related to a study to figure out what needs to be done. Or maybe it's, you know that already and you need to actually hire someone to do the work. Have you spotted the challenge in this? In order, you need to know actually what needs to be done to better figure out who needs to do it. So this second who, the solution to it might have multiple skill sets required. So with that in mind, let's look at the what of stormwater maintenance. What needs to be maintained? Trick question. Everything needs to be maintained, right? I mean, let's face it, everything needs to be maintained. So you need to know what the components are of your stormwater system facilities. And you need to know where they are, because if you don't know what you've got, you don't know what you need to maintain. So let's talk about these components. And I put these into 3 buckets. The first bucket are the engineered or the mechanical systems. We don't need to go into these in any depth. These are pretty straightforward things. They've been constructed, they're engineered. The second are the hybrid components. Now, these are the things that most people think of as your typical stormwater facilities. Oftentimes, they have a mechanical or an engineered component, and then they have a landscape component, like the kinds of features that we see here. And there's the third bucket. Now, let me clarify that these first 2 buckets are usually what your operation and maintenance plans cover. This third bucket is the forgotten bucket, as I like to call it, or it's your natural stormwater system components. But nonetheless, we have natural system components. Oftentimes, these are the open space areas in your subdivisions and your associations. They're the riparian corridors, the streams, the wetlands, and the buffers. And so you might be thinking, well, Julie, they're natural areas. Doesn't nature take care of itself? I mean, that's nature. I would argue, and let's think about it, you have a site that's been constructed. These features are no longer in the natural setting that they used to occupy. So no, they really can't take care of themselves the way they used to. We need to step into that role to help them out. So now we've talked about what needs to be maintained. We got to figure out where they are and where you access them. Now you might think, that's pretty straightforward, and maybe it is. For some of the features, maybe it isn't for all of them. What if you don't know where they are? Where can you go to find the whereabouts? Am I milking that word for all it's worth or what? Where can you go to find the whereabouts of that information? Well, here are some options. I think that the as-built drawings are probably a really undervalued item because they provide information about the built condition That means how it was constructed, right after it was constructed, and especially if they are the approved as-built. That can be really valuable information when it comes down to the long-term processes or plans that you might want to do, say down the road of wanting to do some maintenance of a stormwater basin or replacing a pipe. To do permitting for those types of things, sometimes you're going to want to know, or they're going to be asked, well, what was the size of the original, or what was the original depth? This is very valuable information. Plats of subdivision and deed restrictions are also very helpful because they can identify access locations and easements. And sometimes they will give you information about restricted activities, what you can and cannot do in some of those locations. And then we have the operation and maintenance plan that I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about this one a little bit more. A maintenance plan should provide an inventory of the facilities and their characteristics and the responsible party for that facility. It should also talk about the funding source or sources, in theory, again, dedicated funding sources, not just the hopeful funding sources. It should also tell you about record-keeping procedures, and it should include a time frame for maintenance activities and inspections, those various tasks associated with that, as well as a time frame for updating the plan itself. These are all really important. Now, if you have a plan and it's a little skimpy, these are some resources here that might help beef it up a little bit. So we reviewed where the maintenance needs to be done, but do we know when it needs to be done? When do we know if there's a problem? Well, if you're looking for a sign, here we go. Here are some signs of failing stormwater facilities, and these are not, these are just some of the more common type of signs. For example, you have displaced riprap or something's being undermined. There might be other signs that you might see, hear, or smell. Now, keep in mind, these types of things are not going to fix themselves. So you need to also know when's the right time to start addressing these. When you perform a maintenance task, well, we're not going to talk too much about winter, spring, summer, or fall. Most folks understand about landscape management and maintenance. You're all intimately familiar with raking the leaves and dealing with the yard work, but let's talk a little bit about as needed or infrequent tasks. These are the ones that tend to be the costliest. But I will also say, with respect to any task, do it before it becomes a larger problem, because then it becomes more costly. One other thing I will point out is that in the winter, the salt and snow management, I'm sure folks are pretty familiar with the fact that, you know, we've got salt, we've got snow, we've got to shovel and deal with it. But become educated and aware of the implications of how that is done in your communities, how that affects the landscape management in the other seasons, because it does. All right, the non-routine, as needed and infrequent, these are your big ticket items. So while your association may or should have a regular assessment for your annual maintenance costs, you might want to take a look and see if you've got a maintenance fund going on for your long-term maintenance costs. If you don't, it would probably be a good idea to have a consulting engineer do a replacement fund study. Every stormwater facility has a lifespan. You are going to want to know if your facility is at the beginning, the middle, or getting close to the end of its lifespan, because you are going to need to know how long it's going to take for that to need replacement. That is going to inform your budget and how much you might be needing to start working for assessments. I know it's a horrid word, nobody wants to hear it. I'm in an association, I don't like it either, but it's better to do a little bit every year towards it rather than get hit with a very large unexpected amount at some point and then everyone really cringes. All right, let's talk a little bit about the how you manage your facilities from year to year. You're like, Julie, we got an operation and maintenance plan. That tells us how, right? Well, it's a very good tool, but it is not really set up to deal with the day-to-day or year-to-year nuances of what's going to happen at your site, especially because you've got a living system. So let's talk most particularly about the biologic systems, the native landscapes, because that's my favorite. I'm biased, I admit it. Maintenance of stormwater facilities have selected types of actions. And so here we've got some of them. Notice that there's mowing or cutting 3 different types, and none of them are your turf grass type. These aren't the only types of things that go into your general maintenance. You've also got actions like looking for erosion and repairing eroded banks or bare areas, taking care of your outlet structures and such, looking for the debris and trash and doing that type of cleanup. All right. There are also, however, maintenance conflicts. Oh, one thing I was going to mention, weed management. A recommended rule of thumb, when it gets to about 15% of your cover, that's a good time to start working on your weed management, unless you've got a very aggressive species. Start attacking it early. A lot of folks are like, oh, it's not a big deal right now. Let's put our money towards something that's really more of a problem. But if you let it grow, that little demon is gonna get out of hand quickly. So a little money well spent takes care of it or prevents a bigger problem. So as far as maintenance conflicts go, most of these images depict avoidable conflicts. Things that could be avoided by having some kind of dialogue or better coordination between one contractor and another. However, one of them, the one that you see with the big old backhoe, is what I call an internal or unavoidable inherent conflict, because you are never going to be able to avoid impacting your wetland or other resource when you have to go in and do the big project of dredging. Your wetlands that you've been nurturing, et cetera, and managing are going to get a big hit. So you need to be prepared for both types of conflicts, and clear communication is going to be a key factor in that. So at this point, I'm going to hand you over to Alana, who's going to talk more about different kinds of common management and maintenance practices and some best management practices associated with addressing those.
So yeah, Julie kind of set up the scene well for maintenance, and now we're going to talk about some common issues that you guys see. As Julie said, each of these could be its own topic for a very long time, so we're just going to kind of hit some of the highlights. And of course, these aren't all the issues you guys are dealing with, these are just some of the common ones. These are more geared towards water quality issues, so with your ponds on your property. So I'm going to go through a couple of these. So algae, kind of Kurt mentioned that. We get a lot of algae complaints. I know you guys are dealing with algae in your areas as well. So algae is a result of excess nutrients in the water. So that's things like phosphorus and nitrogen. And that's coming from a couple different sources, external. So that's in your watershed being washed into the pond. But there can also be internal sources. So that's usually the sediment in the bottom of the lake that can get re-churned up in the pond water itself, and that can create more phosphorus. And then that's just the perfect habitat for algae, and then it thrives and it can look like that lovely green stuff that you guys see. So there are some options for dealing with algae, both from a nutrient reduction side as well as addressing the algae itself. So you can look at external sources and the internal for best management practices. Some for the external sources can be things like buffer strips. So putting those native plants along your shoreline, that helps filter out some of the nutrients that are coming into your lake. Fertilizers, using less fertilizers. I wrote eliminate fertilizers. What I really meant to say was eliminate phosphorus fertilizers. So a lot nowadays, there is like a lot of phosphorus-free fertilizer. When you go to the store, that middle number is the phosphorus value. If it's 0, that's a good one to use. You really don't need to use phosphorus for your soil. You can get a test to see if it is lacking in that, and then you could potentially use phosphorus fertilizer. A lot of fertilizer still has nitrogen in it, so that can fuel some of these algae blooms as well. But really with fertilizer, we're talking about also like, when do you do it? Is it going to rain tomorrow? Then today is probably not a good time to put your fertilizer down. because that's just gonna all wash into your pond. Disposing of leaves and lawn clippings, so leaves and lawn clippings, that's phosphorus. So, rather than having that wash into your pond, removing that so it's not falling in there, because then that's just gonna decay and go to the bottom and be an internal source of phosphorus. Septic system maintenance is another one. If you're in an area that people are on septic, making sure you're maintaining that and keeping that up to date, that's important because any leaking from that system will get into the water and that's contributing to these problems. So those are some of the external sources. For in pond, you can look at things like nutrient inactivation. I know there's a bunch of exhibitors downstairs. Some of those do some of these things, such as nutrient inactivation. Also algicides, that's usually copper-based. That will treat the algae itself. So you're not necessarily dealing with the nutrients at that point, you're dealing with what you have, which is the algae. So kind of two different methods to deal with the problem. You can also increase your aquatic plant growth in your pond. So that's gonna outcompete with your algae. So there's phosphorus in there, it's gonna get used up by something. If it's not being used up by plants, it's gonna get used up by algae. So those are just some kind of quick highlights for algae issues. Erosion's another big concern. And these kind of all go hand in hand because phosphorus is a sticky substance. It's gonna attach to sediment. So if you're having erosion concerns, you're also having sediment concerns. And that they kind of all go together. So for erosion, you want to limit any of that sediment and nutrient buildup that's getting into your pond. Some of the similar BMPs can apply for this, such as installing native plant buffers. You might have seen this graphic before of your native plant roots versus your turf grass plant roots. So it might be hard to see, but all the way on the left side, that's your turf grass. Basically no root structure there, right? Your native plants, feet of root structure. And I know some people don't like the tall native plants. You don't necessarily have to have tall native plants. If you look all the way to the right, that one's short, but it still has multiple feet of root depth. So you can kind of pick and choose what type of native plants you aesthetically like as an association and plant it around the buffer. You don't have to have really tall ones. You can also do things like not mowing all the way up to the shoreline, just letting the grass grow a little bit taller than you've been letting it. All that is going to help. But that long root structure helps stabilize the bank. And then there's kind of bigger projects. So that's like bioengineering. So things like riprap, erosion control blankets. That's going to be more expensive, a little more time planning, but those are all really effective for controlling erosion. Sediment buildup. So this is a cause, right, of erosion. It's continuously getting into your pond. It's building up over time. So when it's really heavy rainfalls, you probably notice your ponds are probably pretty murky. And so all that sediment gets in the water column and then it gradually settles out to the bottom. And then that's building up over time. So it's not really going anywhere. It's staying in your pond and your pond is getting shallower and shallower. It's contributing to the algae problems we talked about. So there's a couple different approaches here. One is addressing the sediment that's coming in, and that might take some research. What inlets are in your pond? Where's the watershed that it's coming from? Is there erosion coming from upstream? So that's kind of a bigger project, right? That might not be within your HOA association. But you can also deal with the sediment that's in the pond itself. Julie alluded to dredging, so that is a project. As most of you know, expensive, time-consuming, permits required, so it's a planning process. So if you need to do dredging for your pond, that's something you want to start thinking about in the beginning and planning into your maintenance plan. You're not going to be able to say, okay, we got to do dredging this year and usually make it work. It's kind of a longer process than that. Aquatic invasive species. So sometimes people aren't really thinking about this in terms of their HOA ponds, but it can be a big issue, especially on the size of your pond. So that could be things like Phragmites along the shoreline, so more of your emergent plants, but it could be species that are in the lake itself, so things like Eurasian water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed. And what the problem is with invasive species is they just they're very aggressive, they outcompete your natives, and they choke up that pond. So they're gonna outtake anything that's in there. You might have seen this invasion curve before. It's basically just saying, as that infestation grows, it's more costly to treat it. So the best thing is to attack it early. So if you identify it early, it's much less costly. By the time you notice it and are doing public outreach, you're already way up high on that curve and it's going to be very costly. And I bring this up especially for homeowner associations because we did have a unique case in a stormwater pond right in Libertyville here. And a commercial applicator discovered hydrilla in there, which isn't really in our state yet. It's really common in the southeast portion of the United States, like Florida has a lot of issues. It's kind of on our watch list. So it was found in the stormwater pond. It was likely an aquarium release. There was other invasive species found that are similar to aquariums. And also some non-native lilies. So this was dumped into the lake or potentially their stormwater system, because all those stormwaters, right, drain into the pond. And then what was hard about this case is it directly connects to the Des Plaines River. So if that hydrilla was to get out and then spread, we could potentially have a problem in a much larger area. So things that your homeowner association do, if people do have access to your storm drains or your lake, making sure you educate them about these type of things. If fishing is allowed in your pond, if you have fish and things like that, making sure they're taking the proper protocol to clean their equipment before cooking. And some other best management practices for AIS, really the big one is prevention. Once it's in your lake, it's expensive to deal with. But for some of the plants, there are some really good herbicides to use that do target invasive species directly. And the timing of it, you can keep your natives intact by just targeting your invasives. You mentioned briefly chloride. So that's things like putting your road salt down in the winter to melt our snow and ice for roadway use. But chlorides can be really damaging to the environment. So once they're in our waterway, they're not going anywhere. They're there forever. They're really harsh too. You might even see it on your landscaping. Sometimes it looks like that chemical burn on your vegetation. That's from chloride use from the winter. It's really also a corrosive material, so it does affect your infrastructure as well. And there are some best management practices to use for chlorides. We do partner with Lake County Stormwater Management, Lake County Health Department, and Lake County DOT works with this greater collaboration called the Salt Smart Collaborative. We put on some winter workshops for putting down salt. And they kind of target two different aspects, parking lots and sidewalks, which would be applicable to you guys. If you guys are in charge of removing snow and ice from your HOA property, this could be applicable to you or your contractor that does it. So we have had municipalities and HOAs actually incorporate in their bylaws that their consultant or contractor has to attend one of our workshops. So we have 2 upcoming ones. So you can find more information about that on Stormwater's website. And then this is not really water quality related, but they all connect to some of that structural damage that you're seeing for your stormwater infrastructure. So clogged drainage, failing structures, and this is really having routine maintenance checks for this would be great. So you're routinely checking that infrastructure before it becomes such a problem that it's going to cost you so much money. Julie mentioned that catching things early is really going to save you a lot of money in the long run. And then planning for that repairs. Usually this also requires permits, so kind of understanding that process and making connections there.
All right, we're going to close out because we're just about out of time, if not already, with the why of stormwater management. And we don't have to do a whole lot of this because, the maintenance, you want your stormwater basins to work, you want them to look good. But let's take a larger step back. Why is stormwater management important to begin with? And so many of you have probably already seen this particular slide. Let's focus on this middle number here. You start off with a landscape that doesn't have development and you've got very little runoff. You go to a highly urbanized landscape, you've got a lot of runoff. And quite simply, the reason for stormwater management is that we replace some of this infiltration capacity that has been lost. We want to reduce flooding. We want to help with infiltration and that type of benefit. So with that, if there's any time for questions or whatnot, I guess
2 questions.
I guess there's opportunity for 2 questions.
You were mentioning about salt, okay? What types of salt are we talking here? Would it be an Epsom salt? Does that contain a lot of chloride in it, or?
So most of the salt products out there for like winter maintenance do contain chloride in it. So some are like magnesium chloride, some
That's
are salt chlorides, yeah. So they all,
rock salt, okay,
Yep.
as opposed to like the Epsom salt solutions, so.
Yeah, I'm interested. So many of us, dredging is very expensive and it's difficult to get the stuff out. But I'm interested to know what happens if you never dredge. What is the impact on the stormwater management infrastructure over time if the decision is made not to dredge?
And it depends on kind of the purpose of your stormwater management pond or facility. If it is, the purpose of it is to kind of settle out some of that sediment, it's not gonna really be doing that anymore. And then it's really flushing downstream. So it might be going into the next pond on your property or something like that. It's not really maintaining what it's supposed to be doing anymore. Gradually, that sediment's just gonna build up. So the ability for it to settle out just doesn't happen anymore. And then it's increasing some of those other problems. You might have more nuisance algae, things like that, if you let it go on.
We have one question in the chat that says, we have a homeowner who maintains his vegetation native natural. Is there a way to determine what are invasive weeds, or are there agencies who can evaluate this? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of the probably exhibitors could also help with this as well. So there are agencies that will assess invasive and native. You can also contact Lake County Health Department. We can sometimes do the in-pond invasives and natives. And then for the shoreline, do you guys know any stormwater any? Services for that.
We don't
Okay.
go out and generally do an assessment, no. But there are a lot of good online resources. There are actually a lot of tools to help yourself with these identification apps and those types of features. I think what else? Community groups as well. I know that Conservation at Home has, in the past anyway, they used to go out to various individual houses to take a look at their properties. I don't know if that's still Open Lands is doing that now. I think so. Yes. And I think it sounds like that's all we have time for, so I guess maybe during the break.
Thank you, Julie, Alana, great presentation. Started with SMC and still to this day, I don't speak Latin. I don't know the plant name, but they have an app called, I use Picture This.
Yeah.
If it's a
Oh,
good
yeah.
one. So I'm now almost as smart as Julie.
Say the name again.
Picture This, but it does cost money. It's well worth it. I don't have to learn Latin. Okay, so it is almost 6:15. Feel free if you need to take a break, get up at any time. We do want to stick to the schedule, so let's just kind of get started into the next presentation. If there are other questions in the chat, we'll get to those. So the next presentation, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite here, the Stormwater Funding Assistance Programs. And yes, there's a lot of different funding sources out there at different levels. We've been successful throughout the years to leverage these types of grants because that's the only way we can get our projects done, is to partner up with other government agencies, with landowners, and then apply for these grants. Most grants are reimbursement based, so you have to foot up and then get reimbursed later. They're not just gonna give you this big check in your door. Although a lot of county board members think that that's how it works. So they said, where's the money? You gotta first spend and get reimbursed. So this stormwater funding, we do have internal programs. And Michelle's gonna go over one of our most successful programs, our watershed management grant program. But we also have some other programs. And one of them is our voluntary flood prone property buyout. And what that is for certain structures that are repetitively flooded and they have maybe flood insurance. Well, the federal government has programs that instead of paying out claims for all this flood insurance, when a homeowner takes on water, it might be better for taxpayers to remove that risky property altogether. And we've been pretty successful in buying out homes, commercial properties. The Gurney Grade School was one of them that was bought out and relocated. And we used some grant funds to do that. There are local matches that are required, so we need to find some partners to put up maybe 10%, 25%. And then the very last presentation we have about easements, that's important because the easement has a value. And that can be used as match too. So a property owner that will dedicate an easement or provide an easement, there's a value assigned to that. And that can be used also as match. I mentioned the countywide 319 program through EPA for water quality grants that we got to provide BMPs here. We do this every other year. We solicit proposals and then submit what we call as a countywide proposal to EPA. So it's a bundle of projects and we get the funding and we work with the applicant. Now, you don't have to go through SMC. 319 programs open to everybody. So you can definitely take it on yourself. SMC, our grant managers, we help with all the reporting and we do charge a nominal fee for that. So 319 programs out there, a lot of green infrastructure grants we're seeing. And the DCO, I need to say something about the DCO because that's a new one. It's a very large amount of funding that the state of Illinois is providing to Lake County for regional stormwater projects. And to date, we've received $30 million from the state and we've completed a dozen projects. We're wrapping those up this month. And now we're getting ready to spring into the next round of funding for another $30 million for 16 new projects. And the state's appropriation, that's not even half the appropriation. So there's still a large amount of funds out there. And we are meeting with local governments, with HOAs, to start thinking about these future rounds of projects. So we do want to partner with many of you. We do want this countywide natural drainage system to function. And Alana's and Julie were talking about sediment. One interesting piece of information that we found out is all that erosion that you see on the stream banks. Well, that used to lock up the phosphorus. The phosphorus was in check. It was sitting there stabilized. And so when the rivers and streams are scouring out and destroying land, that phosphorus is getting resuspended into our waterways. And the University of Illinois study that was one study we looked at, 30% of the phosphorus in our waterways is because of the stream erosion. So if we could just stabilize our streams, we could reduce our phosphorus loading by 1/3 almost. So it sounds like a good idea. With that, I'd like to introduce Michelle Pope, our GIS analyst / drone pilot. Flies the drone around like Maverick, Top Gun, it scares me. Like, don't do that. But Michelle also wears some other hats and she's gonna tell us about the WMD grant program.
I am a lead WB grant program manager, and this is the grant program, the WB grant program. So we get so many grant projects. These projects are aimed to help improve particular project locations to reduce flooding and nuisance flooding and increase the water quality around the area. It is a reimbursement cost share program, so you need to fully pay out the total cost, and then we reimburse you up to 50% of the project cost. And it's funded by watershed, so Fox, Des Plaines, North Branch, Michigan, and it's competitive. And I'll explain that later. But normally we have this year it's $189,000 total, and then $12,000 for our WMAG. And then each application, no matter what, requires a WMD member signature. Our current WB project managers, so Jacob, Ashley, and Shireen. Their contact information. And so within the WB program, there is the WB grant, which deals with projects, and then the WMAG, which deals with the growth and sustainability of local watershed partnerships. So WMB, you get 50% of your project cost, but it may be lower if you're in an environmental justice area. There's site-specific project locations for planning, design, and development, and you're required to have a cost match. But if you have in-kind or volunteer hours, that can help towards your half of the 50%. And then the WMAG is 100% up to $12,000. We usually just do one project since it's so small. And again, those, it's for growth and sustainability of watershed partnerships. But there's no cost share required. It doesn't have to be $12,000. It could be less, it could be more, but that's our cap for how much we are gonna give you guys. This is the Fox Point HOA. So example of a WMB grant from back in 2020. The HOA needed to stabilize and maintain the creek that ran through their neighborhood. They had a lot of dead trees, bare spots on the creek, flooding along the portion of the creek. They ended up planting native vegetation, installed some J-hooks, and stabilized the shoreline. And then this was a WMAG from 2023. They developed what was called the Steward of Lakes program. This was from, there was 13 different HOAs around both East and West Loon Lake, and they merged into the Loon Lake Management Association. And each, one member from each of the HOAs is in the total HOA, so the LLMA. So they use their WMAG money to educate the community on the uniqueness of the lakes and how to maintain and preserve the native vegetation and wildlife in the area. They increased the amount of homeowners within the associations and identified that taught homeowners how to identify invasives versus non-invasives. Okay, here's the grant process. So my notes here. So usually in September, August, we do a request for proposals, and we usually have 2 months to do pre-application meetings, which we highly recommend. If they're not required, but we do highly recommend, so you can get the most bang for your buck and get as many points as possible. And then you submit your application to our new info portal, which I'll give you the link later. And then we have about a month and a half to score and refine the projects, and just to see if you're missing anything. We can give you more pointers and all that. Like, you can't change anything, but like if you're missing the budget, send us the budget. That's about it. November 20th is when, for this year, is our WB meeting. So that's when the staff presents their recommendations to the WB board. And then December 5th this year is the final approval of where they are actually 100% approved by SMC. And then afterwards, we work with applicants to develop IGAs, and then the projects can start after the final approval. So any expenditures that incurred before your final approval will not be able to be approved to submitted for your budget. So, and then here is the full grant timeline. This full PDF can be found in the RFP packet. And this is our 9 prioritization scoring criteria. So there's intersectional benefits, which is high, flood hazard reduction, structural damage. Each project manager will assign the criteria rating from 0 to 5, and then multiply it by the score, and then you'll end up with your total score. I just did random numbers here. It's 325, which is a really good score. In order to be even considered to be recommended, you need a 210. So, so work with your WB project manager to boost your score if you need any help. And there's also bonus credits, which we highly recommend trying for. HOAs have a HOA only bonus credit for current stormwater VP implementations. And then here are some tips and tricks for a good application. Don't leave anything blank or NA. We'll put that as a 0. If you didn't write anything. So just write something that pertains to that section and you'll be able to get some, not any. So, and be detailed, explain like we're 5, explain in depth on what is going on, quantify the benefits, like how did the project fare in the 2017 or the project area. And then this is our new inflow website. The link is at the top. And then right here is where you can click to sign up. And then there's options for, I think for HOAs, you'd be other. There's SMC people, there's contractors and other villages. And so like you'd be other. And so just click and sign up and you should get an email saying, hey, thank you for signing for inflow. And then right here is where you download the latest RFP. And then you can click here to look for any other inflow training webinars. And then the last one is posted on that YouTube link down there. Any questions?
So yeah, we have the current WMB cycle that is closing tomorrow at 2 p.m.
Right.
So when you leave here tonight, you got like 6 hours. But we do this every year. So it's an annual program. So if you miss out, you did miss out. You got time to work with our staff, refine a proposal. And we do want you to have a competitive project. So Michelle, we have usually more projects than funds, so we have to use that priority scoring criteria. And that's what we use, so that's what you should use too. Think about it. That's what we're looking at, try to get those points for flood damage reduction. But some years, if it's not as competitive, maybe we will fund a project that is, it's just a little nuisance problem. It all depends on what type of proposals we got.
And usually we get all the proposals like the day before or the day of. I've been getting emails all night saying, hey, you got another email proposal. It's like, okay, but they can't talk to us and refine their project to make sure it's a better score because they submitted too late. So the earlier you submit, the more you talk to us, the better your project.
And we're talking to people that registered for this in-person workshop. So you guys were on time. There's a lot of people that called us last night. I know we got some extra seats, but being timely and communicating with us, we want to help you with your project. So that's a little introduction of our funding programs. We do have the next presentation at 6:45. So we have about 15 minutes for breaks, some questions. There might be some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat about asking about how many submissions per year for how many slots.
Okay. So the for the WMB, I think that's what they're meeting, trying to ask that question. You know, Michelle showed the slide of the total funding for the county-wide program of $189,600. And of that, we divvied it up. This is based on the EAV, which is the equalized assessed value of properties. So those percentages help allocate what funding should go to the Lake Michigan watershed, Branch Display and Fox. So of these funding allocations, the question, how many slots, it all depends on how much funding is being requested. For example, in the Lake Michigan watershed, we have $27,776. We typically get proposals that are asking for that full amount. And so we might wanna have more projects, so we'll talk with the applicant. If you've got less, can you still get your project done? If we have 2 projects, we wanna help out. I'd say on average, it's what, like 4 to 7 per
Well,
watershed?
Des Plaines usually has, there's been upwards of 12 that have applied, at least. I think we funded Des Plaines last year, the year before, we got 7. We funded 7 Des Plaines.
So it's hard to put a number on that. But there are sometimes, specifically for the North Branch and the Lake Michigan watershed, we don't get any proposals. And what do? Well, we move those funds into a different watershed and fund them. So if you're in the North Branch in Lake Michigan, I'd say submit your projects. There's not a lot of competition. There is a lot of competition in Des Plaines and the Fox. You just see by the area of how large those watersheds are. And yeah, we usually get a large amount of submittals in there. So that's where you do want to be competitive.
Yes.
Watersheds. You want to be competitive for all.
But again, we can't submit a really bad project knowing that there might be 0 projects because it still needs to be 210 and above to even be considered to be recommended.
One project I received, someone wanted to repair their loading dock. That's maybe somebody else department.
And it can't be single property projects either. It has to help more than one person.
I just wondered for Meg, are the criteria and the timeline the same as for WMP?
Criteria is different, timeline is the same.
You can find that somewhere.
That link that Michelle shared, that RFP packet.
It has all the list of everything, of how we score each of them, so.
And from year to year, it doesn't really change dramatically. So if you have last year's RFP packet, it's gonna be pretty much the same.
Do you sometimes see the differences in the headwaters that are provided from Wisconsin into these major rivers? And how it affects either increasing or decreasing, you know, the water?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if the WMB grant's gonna address that though.
Okay,
But
so-
we do know that the Upper Des Plaines River watershed, which extends up into Union Grove, Wisconsin.
I think up in that area. Yeah.
There's about 125 square miles that drains into Illinois down the Des Plaines River. And yes, that's a major concern, and we are working with the US Department of Agriculture, this major watershed study, and possibly gonna have a meeting in December about that coordination effort. Then the Fox River is even larger. I think it's about 1,000 square miles that drains into the chain of lakes. And then the Fox River is interesting. It weaves in and out of McHenry and Lake County. The North Branch, it's interesting, right here, that's a headwater. It starts in Lake County. So if you go up to Grand and Green Bay Road, it's kind of like you're in that four corners of Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, where you can be in 4 states.
You
You can be in 3 watersheds, but you're gonna be in the middle of a road, so be careful. But this is where the Chicago River starts. So when you're down Chicago, walk along the nice river walk. They dump all the little ducks in there and paint it green. This is where it starts, in the North Branch. But you don't see the river. It's a headwater, so there's all these little dendritic fingers they call, and they get filled in. So it's a problem. We have a lot of major issues like Park City, Waukegan, and Gurnee. Yeah, we do need to think about what's coming in from the north because southeast Wisconsin is developing at a rapid pace. And Julie's slide about the urbanization, that means more runoff. But we also need to be good stewards too, because all our runoff goes downstream. And eventually, like the Chicago River, it goes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And then another interesting fact is if you're in the Lake Michigan watershed, that's a whole different subcontinental divide that water goes from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron, all the way up through the St. Lawrence Seaway out to the Atlantic Ocean. But if you're on the other side of the road, it's going down to the Gulf of Mexico. So if you're in Colorado, we talk about the continental divide. Well, here's the subcontinental divide. We should like open up some restaurants.
With the wetlands being drained over in the Gurnee area, Grandview area, is all of that wetland water being directed then toward the, Chicago River or toward the Des
Gurnee?
Plaines River?
Probably.
Oh, yeah.
It all runs off somewhere. But I will say that wetlands and green infrastructure, these plants, they soak up water too. They help slow down flooding. They take it up. There's evapotranspiration.
I'm speaking about the areas that are being developed right now and how they're taking away the wetlands and that they're draining the water resources that were there off to some other location. I don't know if you're aware of that and how that might affect the homeowners associations on that area.
Yeah, so we do have our watershed development ordinance that's been in effect since 1992. And that regulates development. So if there's a land disturbing activity that exceeds a certain size threshold, or if you're impacting wetlands or filling floodplains, our ordinance requires developers and property owners to mitigate. So all these detention ponds, developers don't just put in detention ponds because they like them.
Aren't they supposed to give like notice to all of the homeowners associations
That would
of
probably
what
be,
they're up to and what they do?
that would be a municipal
I see. Okay.
ordinance for the notifications. In our ordinance, we don't have a requirement like that, so that's at the.
Yeah, I had a question. With all the projects, you mentioned a few like case studies and stuff, and all of them have to do with actually properties that have lakes and retention ponds. Do you ever see projects with HOAs that don't have any water structures, but they do have, drainage issues and stuff like that? Is that something that happens or no?
Yeah, we have like stormwater infrastructure, which is another fund that we do.
So that's a separate from this one?
The SURF, it's the same process, so you apply as a WMB, but you can switch you over to SURF, which has different amount of funds, so it's not out of the same bucket of funds.
Thank you.
And yeah, there's flooding problems from neighbors pointing downspouts at each other. We don't
I mean,
wanna get into
you mentioned
that.
the Four Corners areas, that's kind of where we are. So-
We're,
We're
don't,
trying to help Four
parcel to
Corners.
parcel, it's probably not the level we're at. We're a little broader at subdivision level, regional watershed. But yeah, water that falls on a roof gets collected in a gutter, goes down a downspout. We talked about downspout disconnecting. So there's a lot of different information out there, and I recommend and I encourage you to apply and see your project, because maybe we're facing another major problem real close, and it's easy to fix both at the same time. Mary.
Yeah, I just want to commend you guys. Your sense of humor is great, but also the materials and resources made available here. I'm part of Lake County Lake Lovers with Paul on the anchoring the other corner of the room, but we see things all across the globe, and the resources that you're putting forward here for the county are really incredible. So I want to commend you for that. And Alana and her team checking the waterways everywhere has been so helpful. And I had a question just as a follow-up because of the questions on algae. I know Fox Lake and I believe St. Mary's are looking at the muck pellets or enzymes, and that wasn't listed here. What's your current view of those, and what would you suggest people do to get started?
Yes, those are pretty popular. There's not a lot of third-party peer-reviewed literature on it, so we're kind of waiting for more of that to come out before we talk more about it. But anecdotally, some people have used it and love it. Some people have used it and not seen too much progress. It really depends on also the sediment substrate. It needs to be a more organic material, which you can test for.
Can I follow up with Alana on that today there? So Alana, you talk a lot about phosphorus, and that's a challenge Kurt you mentioned as well, and then we know it gets stuck in the sediment. And so one of the things on the slides was the dredging, which is long and expensive. The other thing people approached us on is maybe locking in phosphorus in the sediment to trap it. But we don't know much about it. What's your experience with that, and what would you say about that as an alternative?
Yeah, so that's definitely an alternative. So there's it's kind of part of that sediment inactivation or the nutrient inactivation products. So like Phoslock alum, it traps the phosphorus into a flocculant kind of on the bottom. There is like limited spaces for how much phosphorus is attached, so it does have like a lifespan to it, but it is an effective product for removing phosphorus from the water column.
Right, well, we got about 5 minutes. Was there any chats or?
Yes, there was a question about, or that says, Our subdivision is pretty old. Where do I find our operation and maintenance plan? Are they filed somewhere?
Great question. I wanted to mention that earlier. So Julie mentioned these resources where you can find information about permitted plans, as-built drawings, deed restrictions, plats of subdivisions. Your best point of contact is your local municipality that was the permitting entity, probably. SMC, we do have records and files, so I'd say, and Julie's here, right? Start with your local municipality, ask for if they have copies of the permitted plan sets, if they have a file, they should retain those records, and if they don't, we might have it. And then the county, all recorded documents, if you're recording a deed or a plat of subdivision, I'll say it is no easy task. But if you hunt and peck and open up 100 different things, maybe you'll find something useful. There are old plats, old easement documents. It's an art to kind of navigate the county's recorder's website, but we have found some really good information out there. If you're in a newer association or newer subdivision, you probably have those documents. They're maybe in your covenants, conditions, restrictions, your master documents. But yeah, if you can find an operations and maintenance plan, that would have been required possibly through the watershed development permit. So yeah, your municipality, check with us. If it doesn't exist, that doesn't mean you're lost. You can create one.
And I will say that the age of the subdivision has a lot of influence on the quality of that document. You might find the operation and maintenance plan to be really great in a more recent subdivision and very, very minimalistic in a much older subdivision. And some of that is just the learning process from the regulatory agency's standpoint, but it's always worth an effort to try to find that information. If you go onto Lake County online maps and you look at the drop down where it looks at the municipalities, you can turn on a subdivision layer. That will oftentimes get you a link to be able to turn on where the plat is for that particular location. That's one resource. If you turn on the lot boundaries, it will identify the municipality or the location that it's in and your enforcement officer for the stormwater provisions. That's another resource for reaching out to that individual to find out if that municipality was even the party that did the permitting at the time that the subdivision was developed. Some municipalities were not certified at the time a subdivision was developed and they later became certified. So these are resources where you can make outreach efforts to initiate your review on your own behalf, at least to start out with.
So I have a stormwater agreement. We've had it, since 1995. It encompasses other properties off of our property as well that is monetarily responsible. We've tried to get that money and tried to reach out to the other parcels that are around us, only to be told we have no responsibility for that. Is there someone that can help us traverse this? I mean, we've given it to lawyer upon lawyer upon lawyer. We've talked to the municipality. Municipalities told us that it's a moot document. And I'm like, well, what replaced then this document if it's a moot document? It says it's in perpetuity, so I'm assuming perpetuity means forever. Is there somebody here at the stormwater management that can help me with this drainage agreement? To me, it's written in Sanskrit.
Sure. So it sounds like, yeah, it's the site specific. I don't know which community it is.
It's an HOA document. It's between the parties that are on it, the developer, the municipality, a bank. There's other people that are signed on. It has, I call it the surveyor, in the back of what properties are included in this drainage agreement. Cause we have a lot of stuff that comes, not a lot. We have a couple that come from off our property that go through our property to then, the Sequoia Creek. So, or into a forest preserve. So we would just like, cause it's a lot of money for an HOA and we would like to know if we can get $20 from somebody else to help us out, we would love to be able to do that. And on top of that, if that's not the case anymore, then, is there another document that we should be looking at?
Sure, I can take a look at that.
I would
So if
appreciate
you,
that.
follow me afterwards.
Perfect, thank you, I appreciate that.
All right, any other chat?
6:45.
See me.
Okay.
Okay, so, thank you, Michelle, about stormwater funding. Michelle's your friend for the program. Here are the contacts, Jacob, Ashley, and Shireen for the different watersheds. So thank you for the stormwater. Now at this time, since we're running right up to 6:45, I'd like to introduce Walter Willis, the Executive Director of SWALCO, and Emily to talk about the stormwater related programs at SWALCO.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Walter Willis. I'm Executive Director of the Solid Waste Agency of Lake County, and Emily Walker is our Communications Associate. So, got a couple questions before I get going here. How many of you have ever heard of SWALCO? Oh, wow. I guess we can just. How many of you have ever actually participated in one of our programs? Well, that's one of the main reasons that we're here tonight. Is we were brainstorming about how we can better inform people about our program, especially our household chemical waste program, which we don't want people pouring us down the drains, things like that, and also our rain barrel program. But we have other programs that are very valuable, and we think that the HOAs, once they find out how many there are in the county, that you might be a good conduit for information about our programs to your residents in your HOA. So I'm going to give you a quick overview and then talk about some of the programs. Emily's going to talk more about some of the education things and how you can sign up and become aware of our program so you can share that with the residents in your HOA. We're a joint action agency, so we've been around for over 30 years. So basically we're 43 municipalities, most municipalities in the county and the county itself are members of the agency, and we all work together to divert material from the landfill and create a more sustainable environment here in Lake County. You guys can see that information. We've got a lot of different programs that are going on. As far as electronics, we collect those at no cost to residents, clothing and textiles, our household chemical waste program, et cetera. So we do a lot, and we wanted people to be aware of our programs. Like I said, we operate the largest electronics program in the state. So if you've got an old TV or old computer, just go on our website. We have drop-off sites throughout the county at no cost. Textiles and shoes is one of our growing programs. We actually make quite a bit of revenue for our agency on that. And we've got boxes all over the county, really over 100, I think, different locations. And then we collect shoes separately as well. A lot of that material we collect is reused and repurposed. We do special collections as well. This actually we have a cost for these programs, but if you have some of the old propane tanks, the smaller ones that you use for camping, latex paint, and also fire extinguishers. We're also taking car seats. So we try to be responsive to what people are, the needs that they have as far as we get a lot of calls on those materials. So that's another program that we have. We do that every other month for most of the year. I'm going to let Emily talk real quick about what Recycle Coach is all about.
So Recycle Coach is hopefully coming at the end of October, I believe, launching for all of our municipalities. And it'll be a web application and also phone application that can tell all of it is specific to each municipality. So it will be able to tell you what goes where and give us or give you drop-off location options or recycle reuse options, pickup schedules and reminders, as well as outbound communications like alerts or notifications about events, and then also give you the ability to report a problem.
So if your HOA is in an incorporated municipality, that's going to become a really good tool. We find that when people go to figure out, can I recycle this? They go to multiple sites. They can go to our website where we have individual pages for each town. They can go to the hauler's website. They often have an individual page. A lot of times the information is not the same. So that confusion is something we're trying to kind of do away with Recycle Coach. Hopefully over time, and Emily's doing a lot of the data input to build it up behind the scenes. But if you go to Mount Prospect, they're one of the towns that actually uses Recycle Coach. You can go on there and kind of see what it looks like. But you can actually take pictures of items with your phone once you have the app. It'll tell you whether it's recyclable or not, or if it's not, maybe where else you can take it. So we hope it becomes kind of ubiquitous throughout Lake County. We don't have multiple websites, multiple sources of information. Confusion creates uncertainty about our programs and whether things get recycled or not. They do. But so Recycle Coach is something that the state has invested in that we're taking advantage of here in Lake County. So that's a really good tool.
And it'll be on our website, so you can just plug in your zip code and then you'll be able to access your schedule and everything, or you can download the app as well.
So a lot of you might be unincorporated Lake County, which a lot of you know now that the county actually did a contract for the unincorporated areas of the county. You might be in a township that has a program like that, one single hauler. So all that information you should be able to access no matter where you're at in Lake County, closest area to you. Our household chemical waste program. Now we get a lot of people that'll call us last minute and go, hey, I'm moving. They did the walk around and I got a lot of stuff I gotta get rid of. What do I do? You know, so, well, you can schedule programs with us. We have 2 events every month at our facility in Gurnee. We're gonna be in Zion. And so we're kind of doing a pitch. I've got some flyers I'm gonna leave over here, both English and Spanish. We're gonna be in there September 21st. So if you're anywhere near Zion Benton High School, or that event's gonna be from 8 to 2 that day, I think. Please get the word out, because we need a few more people to get registered for that event. But that's something that we hear a lot is this last minute move out. What do I do with all these chemicals I have in my basement or whatever? So, and really that's one of the things we partner really strongly with Kurt and SMC on is, you know, trying to keep those waterways clean and make sure people know about that program that we have. We've been doing it for a long time and it's been a very successful program. Rain barrels, we typically have a sale every year. So keep an eye out for that. It's a great way to capture that water coming down the downspout and use it for your own gardening purposes. And obviously that reduces the impact on the water and getting into our waterways, et cetera, and makes it easier to manage it. Plus, basically people are getting that rainwater and using it instead of turning on their spigot and using their own water for their home. So we do those every year typically in the spring. And so that's something that we would, again, Emily's gonna talk about at the end, how do you get on our listserv, if you will, and get emails from us. Our newsletter, now that we've hired Emily, we have a monthly newsletter. So we've got a lot of content coming out. So we'd love for you guys to plug into that. Let's talk about this. Our goal here is to try to get information through the HOAs to your residents. We see this as an opportunity that we haven't tapped into. So we hope that we can be partners and that you as HOA, I'm guessing a lot of you are sitting on HOA boards, et cetera. I am in an HOA for the first time and I know I get emails from them. So if there's a way that you can take our information and spread it to your residents, that's kind of what we're looking for here. So Emily, yeah, this is you.
Yes. So our mailing list, if you go to swalco.org and then click the mail icon, you can sign up for our newsletter. This is what it looks like on the phone and then on the desktop. And you plug in your email and then sign up. We send out a monthly newsletter that has updates about programs and calendar with all of our monthly events. And then we also send out reminders about events that are going on. You can also, on our website, find our Facebook, which we post different weekly tidbits about our programs, shout outs to our programs that we offer, and then also just informational updates about different news that's coming out about household chemical waste.
There's always something new. For the first time, really would take the vapes. People didn't know what to do with those things, the nicotine ones, not the marijuana. We can take those now, so we're trying to get the word out about that. And batteries, we're gonna start taking the alkaline single-use batteries here pretty soon, so that's something we can get the word out about. So you guys are just kind of a conduit, if you will, and we'd like to really leverage and really appreciate the time that you gave us. We had a short time here to talk a little trash with you, but if I get people going about recycling, I can probably go online with you guys. People love to talk about recycling.
Someone asked if you have shredding events.
We do. Quite a few of them, actually. So
Lots of our reuse-aramas, reuse and recycle aramas. There's more to this webpage, so if you scroll down further, we will notify through our newsletter, but also on the calendar and newsflash widgets on our webpage. You can see any reuse arama events. We typically do shredding there.
yeah, we've got, and you're doing like a monthly thing, like on the 21st, we've got several things going on
Yeah.
besides the Zion event. We've got a Reduce-A-Rama, we've got
I
something
think 2
else.
reuse aramas.
So we do a lot of the shredding events and people love those. And we usually marry those up with, hey, bring us some clothing or something else as well.
Household items.
So we. Questions? All right, I knew that.
I have one. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of disposing pharmaceuticals? People who want to put them down their drains, and then the impact of that when they go into septic fields and then maybe into our waterways that way?
Yeah, as far as the science on that, I'm not, an expert on that, but we worked very hard to get an extended producer responsibility law passed in Illinois, and that law went into effect this year. So now the pharmaceutical industry is actually paying for pharmaceutical collection programs. So most our police departments have drop boxes. Most of the retailers, a lot of the retailers have drop boxes. So we've increased the access tremendously. Obviously, it's an environmental issue, like you're saying, and it's also a public safety issue. Leaving drugs in your home and people getting access to them that who probably shouldn't. So we've got excellent information on our website about all those locations. So we've really shifted that. For many years, we ran that program with the police department and the health department. And now we've shifted that burden to pharmaceutical industry, and you should be able to find a location fairly easily through our website. It's really grown tremendously, and obviously we want to keep that out of our waterways and public safety issue.
So if we did a spring community event, would we be able to get any type of flyer to promote the sale of your rain barrels?
Yes.
Like, so we could just contact you and
We could load you up with anything you need, a little blurb you might want to put in a newsletter, a flyer, because we do develop a flyer. We sell several hundred every year, so we've sold thousands of them over the years. We also sell backyard composters, which are pretty cool. You can put most of your food scraps in there with your yard waste. I don't recommend meats, but I've had a backyard composter for many years, and they work really well. And I haven't had a lot of problems with critters and stuff.
A number of us in the neighborhood I live in converted almost all of our yard tools to battery powered. And we were discussing, several neighbors were discussing, how do we get rid of these gas powered small motors that we don't want to just hand off because they pollute so badly? Any idea how we can get rid of old small weed whackers, blowers?
Yeah, typically when people call us with that, we'll instruct them. Most of the scrap yards will take that if you drain the fluids out of it. So that would be an option. Now, we did apply for a grant, a federal grant, but would actually have offered a subsidy to buy back the gas powered equipment, et cetera. We didn't get that, but the state of Illinois did. So that's something that once we learn about what that program is that the state has, if there's a buyback provision, then that's something that, on our newsletter, et cetera, we would start sharing that information. I thought you were gonna ask me, well, when that battery runs out of my rechargeable lawnmower, which I have one of those, it's rather a large battery. We don't currently take those large batteries, but we just passed another extended producer responsibility law where the battery industry was supportive of. And in 2026, we will be in the business of taking those medium-sized batteries, the batteries you have on the bikes, the e-bikes. We're not getting into the EVs yet, but our facility will be able to take both the single use and the medium-sized batteries in the next year or so. So it's a great way to, convert away from those, because those are very polluting, all the lawnmowers, et cetera, really don't have any muffler or any kind of pollution control on them. So, but that's something that I do believe that the state is gonna have a program.
All right, thank you,
All
Walter
right.
and Emily. How many people have seen that TV show Drain the Oceans on the Learning Channel? Right? Shows the simulated Drain the Ocean, you see what's under the water. Well, Sylvan Lake Dam is a real project that we're working on. We drained a lake. I don't know if you saw the news articles, but there's a lot of trash.
Yeah.
People were like, oh, there's my old mug I lost 20 years ago. Yeah, so we don't want that stuff ending up in the water. Okay, so next, we have a case study of an HOA. So this is one of your kind. So I'd like to introduce the Countryside Lake Association and the president, Clyde Kaufman. He's gonna give us a presentation on collaboration for successfully navigating inlets, watersheds, and lake health. And yeah, the Countryside Lakes area, we know that there's a strong interest in protecting that lake. It's part of the reason why people want to live there and have a really good lake. So Clyde, I want to welcome you in.
Thank you, Kurt.
Take it away. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, I'm Clyde Kaufman, and we should start by thanking Shereen. She's done a great job. I know, Kurt, you're gonna do it later and you've already done it, but thanks for everything to help us get here. So that's my pitch. Sweet. So no, we're here as part of the, Kurt wanted to do a peer-to-peer. So I'm really excited to be here today, talking about from our HOA, kind of what we've learned, what our story was, what we struggle with, some of the things we've tried to overcome. I've got two of my colleagues here today, Mary Spiewak and Allie Kamen, so they'll do some color commentary along the way. But give you guys just to put some context here. So we are unincorporated Lake County. So that means we're kind of, who helps us? I mean, we don't have a village manager, we don't have a mayor or anything like that. But as you can see from the map, I don't know how visible it is, but we're near Gilmore and Midlothian Road. And that's us, that's about 140 acre private lake. And as I've learned, because I've now been on the board for 2 years, a member of our association for 6, we are part of Kurt and the whole Lake County stormwater management ecosystem. So there are a number of inlets that drain into our lake and then we go downstream. So it became very important for us to understand the ins and outs. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So before we get started, I just want to understand the audience a little better. How many folks here are part of an HOA that's rather large, 500 or more members by show of hands? Okay, so there's a couple. How about 250 to 500? Okay, and less than 250, a smaller association. Okay, good. So we got a pretty good balance here. And how many of those HOAs are self-managed? And how many use a management company? Okay, so predominantly management company. All right, so let me introduce us a little bit as I was talking. I'll click ahead here just to keep going here. So we were formed almost 100 years ago. And the story is we took this wetlands, not personally, but this fellow named Sam Insel. I don't know if you guys know Sam. He was Thomas Edison's private secretary. Big shot, billionaire back in 1926. Made his money in electricity, ComEd. Well, he decided that he and his friends back in the day wanted their own private hunting and fishing lodge. So they bought up 900 acres in Lake County, much less developed than today. And they took this wetland area and created a dam. So it's a man-made lake. They dug it out, they dredged it. And that's what we live on today. And what's kind of interesting is while the number of acres hasn't changed in what's in the span of control, as you can see, the membership has changed dramatically. And that's posed a lot of problems too with all the building over the years. We now have a subdivision that's across Gilmer Road. And so people getting there, it's much different than what it was. Horses used to ride around there. So we've had to evolve kind of what we've done to do our fiduciary responsibility. But as an HOA, if you read our covenants, the primary purpose we exist for is to make sure the lake is there for the use and enjoyment of all members. And that's been one of our challenges, is over time, almost 100 years later, someone talked about useful life. How long is useful life? Well, our lake, what's the useful life before Mother Nature tries to bring it back to its wetlands? All right, so I thought I would just go through quickly, just to kind of, peer to peer, talk a little bit about not just our lake issues with what we're trying to do, but a little bit about who we are. So from a revenue standpoint, obviously we collect dues. We're about $1,100 per household a year, but we also get money from parcel transfer fees as people sell homes. There's a fee for that. And we finally got, I wouldn't say creative, but we caught up to the times. We actually put our reserves and other money to work. And with interest rates up, we were able to generate about $15,000 of interest income, which was money, just found money for the association. So that was good for us. On the expense side, our biggest expense is lake. And it is expensive to keep up. We've talked about how do you keep the algae out? How do you keep the weeds down? How do you keep the harmful algae blooms? What do you do about phosphorus? And so just doing maintenance, we spend well over $100,000 a year on. And then we spend money on, keeping the docks up, the facilities, and then obviously we have a private security, which is part of it too. So this is just something we threw in because we thought it might be relevant. I'm curious, how many folks here by association still primarily collect manual checks for their dues? Anybody still do that, or are we the only ones? Yeah, a lot of people, I see it kind of like we don't want to say it. So can you cut that from the tape back there? We don't want that in the public. But we've had members. I'm sorry, what did you say?
You're a globalist.
A globalist. Oh. Think local, act global. That's what Kurt always tells me. So, I'm trying to be balanced here. But in reality, we had several members at our annual meeting say, the only time I still write a check is for my HOA dues. What can you do about it? So we've kind of coined this thing called second century as we approach our 100th year anniversary, said, what can we do to get into the 21st century? And the things that we're in the process of, good news is this fall, we're rolling out an email to all of our members saying we will now accept ACH and Zelle payments. So you'll get it in your email, you could push a button, you'll be done in 30 seconds. That's a big change for us, but we thought it was necessary to do. We'll see how that goes. We do want to, in 2026, be able to go into electronic voting. That would be helpful. And then, as far as delivery for official communications, I'm sure you're all aware that Illinois has some pretty strict laws on it's required for people to opt in, your members, if you want to receive official communications other than through the USPS. How many associations have been successful getting the majority of their members to opt in at this point? Okay, just a few. You want to come up here and tell us your secrets? We'd really like to hear that, because that is something we're spending time on. All right, and the most important thing is at the bottom. We're one of those communities that, we have used a lot of chemicals to spray. And chemicals have a good use and they're very effective, but we're moving to a hybrid approach because we think there has to be a balance. Because over time, we're concerned about the ecosystem of the lake if all we did was chemicals. So we want to be balanced. We think they both have a place. So a little bit about our story. So these pictures up here just kind of say, there's a picture of our beach. We have members who love to enjoy swimming with their families at picnics. You've got, don't tell anybody, that's a nice fish that was caught. We won't tell you exactly where that fishing spot is, although we have members who have those secrets. There's boats. We only allow 15 horsepower, pontoons, kayaks, paddleboard, so it's not a jet ski lake. And then, of course, there's the scenery that people love to enjoy. So a really good story. Now, here's what's going on. Now, this isn't every day, but this is a bad day for us. So one of our members coined the phrase, we are a private lake, Kurt, filled with public phosphorus. Think about that. Public phosphorus. And why is that? It's 80% of our water comes in from the Indian Creek Inlet. Upstream, we've got golf courses, we've got new developments and communities, we have farmland, and over the years, that has continued to drain in. So when you talk about stream bank, Julie, I think mentioned, and Alana, stream bank and shoreline stabilization, that's something that we'll be talking about in a moment. But we had a few bad days. Mother's Day was one of them this year. You can imagine how well that went over with our members, but lots of weeds, difficult to navigate, and very, very low levels of dissolved oxygen. Any of these, for anybody who has a pond or lake, are we the only one, or do we have any friends here? Yeah, a couple? Yeah, phosphorus is our enemy, there's no question. So that's been happening. Now, we had some good days, there's no question about it. And so you don't have to look further than what's going on in Florida as an HOA, at least our perspective. That the boards now have fiduciary responsibilities to look at long-term care of the critical infrastructure. Our lake, for us, is no different than the condominiums in Florida and Surfside that had all those parking garages and cement. That's their infrastructure. So if we become aware of things, we have to acknowledge it. We've got to get studies done, and we've got to understand what choices, because this may, and I don't think it's going to happen for decades, but if it reverted back to wetlands, it would also not allow us to fulfill our duty to make it usable for our members. But more importantly, given that it's part of the ecosystem here, I think it would have a dramatic impact on how the drainage would work too. So we want to keep it fresh and alive and going. All right. So what brought us here is we just randomly learned about a culvert replacement project that was going on in Gilmer Road, which happens to be about half mile from our lake. And it's right where the Indian Creek Inlet comes in. And we're like, ooh, this might be an opportunity. Think about all that sediment and phosphorus that comes in. Maybe we can put some traps in. Maybe we could, as they redo this culvert, we can get some improvements. On the other hand, if it's larger or there aren't any improvements, will this deteriorate? So we didn't know, but we got very curious. And what we realized is that, and this is my term, an afterthought. And what we mean is, are we top of mind? Do we have a seat at the table? And so we did a little study here, and we realized that, as I mentioned earlier, unlike villages or municipalities, we don't have dedicated people who look after these local government officials in the county and work together and build relationships. So we did, for this presentation, just a little analysis of the list of cities and villages and recognized entities in Lake County. There's about 85 or so. And the ones in yellow there, we're actually larger than. If you take the average in our membership of you take the 371 members times the average household in Lake County of 2.88, you get a little bit north of 1,000. So we're like, we have a voice, we have a right to be at the table, and it's up to us, not the county, to be proactive and do something. Is that reasonable to anybody? Yeah. So we were behind the eight ball. That's at least how we saw it. I don't know if I like the click art, but I gotta tell you, whoever puts your slides together, we need to borrow them, because you guys, all those guys had great modern slides, but we didn't have a dedicated resource for what I'm calling government relations. Okay, somebody who can be there and get to know folks and kind of have us get to know what's going on. And we'll talk about some of the power of that. Part of our challenge is we have 9 members on our board. Every year, 3 of those members turn over. So you always have a constant turn, and it's hard to keep that continuity. Kurt, how long have you been with Stormwater Management?
18 years.
Yeah, 18 years. It's like, so how, if we've got new members every year and he's been there 18, you're not gonna wanna talk to new people every year like a revolving door.
That's why we have this workshop every year.
See?
Yeah.
See, there you go. You can thank me later for that. Unrehearsed, honestly. And the challenge for us is, we're a self-managed organization. So we're told by our attorneys, we're one of the larger self-managed organizations. So, and we're all volunteers, which is fine, but it takes time. So the question is, where do you want to spend your time? And is it worth it? So as we keep going, we reach this crossroads. What are we going to do? We have 3 choices. And, we could continue to do what we did, which is really, we've had what I'll call opportunistic type outreaches to people when it made sense. And, maybe 20 years ago we had it, but with the turnover, we've gone the other way. Or we could go all the way down to being proactive and build relationships. And the board decided to be proactive. And so we've gotten involved. And there are some real benefits that are starting to pay off. Now, I will give our Lake Management Committee a ton of credit because they started early. They were kind of our pilot last year, and they worked with Alana. And we were one of 10 lakes selected for last year's study. Our lake had not been studied in well over a decade or two. Is that correct, Lana?
Yeah, about a decade.
About a decade. And so we were selected in an evaluation and study by the Lake County Health Department. Gave us tremendous information about our depth, about where our shorelines had red, yellow, green maps of where we really needed to make sure we could put the right buffer zones in and which ones are the ones that had emergencies and a whole bunch of information. So that was all done by the county. It cost us 0 out-of-pocket dollars. And so that's all because we invested some time. And now, since we're starting to invest in others, we started with our Lake County Board Commissioner, Adams, and he was great at giving some introductions to help point us in the right direction so we can navigate. We've had members, I think it's Elaine Davis.
Yeah, Eileen Davis from
Eileen
the
Davis
Forest
from
Preserve.
Forest Preserve, coming in, talking with our members about natives. Because imagine in an HOA, if one of the neighbors said to another neighbor, back to, do you get involved in the gutter problems? I don't think I like your native lawn anymore. You can't do that. HOA, what are you gonna do about it? Not a place we wanna be in. The state of Illinois obviously says that's not our purview either, but she was really good about talking about just kind of taking the myths away that people had about the good and the bad. So we leveraged Lake County there. Alana has been to our annual meeting and really tried to educate all the folks, and that's where we came up with phosphorus as our enemy, not each other. And that was a really good breakthrough for us. And then with Kurt, we've been working hard to talk about projects. He talked about they have ideas, they have money, but they need partners. So we do know that partners are important. And not only is our lake part of it, but there's a couple kind of wetlands just to, I guess it's the north of us, that we weren't even aware drained into our lake. And we're gonna do some things talking about how to do that because we can control the flow of that water, which would be much better for flooding in some local areas. And then extending beyond Lake County here, even in Fremont, we've been partnering with Alicia Dodd, who is part of Fremont Township on the Highway and Transportation Group, and Diane O'Kelly, who's a supervisor, help leveraging their skills and talents to really help us with some of our signage and putting it up because we wanted to avoid having our people going on township land and without the proper training, without the proper tools, without the proper reliability. So what the point I'm trying to make is it helps us as HOA fulfill our duty by figuring out ways to leverage the value of our.
So how would you know if they?
Governments. And so here's our lessons learned. We call it a seat at the table. Having a seat at the table is important, being able to build the relationships, ask questions, learn where people need help. Again, as I said, that's our right as HOAs. And so it was incumbent upon us, we learned, to go ahead and make that investment because we didn't have elected officials to do that for us. Kurt, I put a help wanted sign out there because I've learned as I've gotten to know you is you want help, okay? It's important. You can't do this alone. You don't want to do it alone. And what's really interesting, I've learned over the years that when, if I said your name was Walter, if you ask, let me back up on this one here. It's right here. I didn't practice this one. If I said, do you need my help? Most people say, no, I got it. They're covered because it's a sign of weakness. But if you, Walter, said, Clyde, I really want your help, I'd say, of course, I'll be happy to help you. So when someone asks, the whole idea is to get people to ask for your help. So now that Kurt's asking for us, we're going to work with him. And so that's a good way. We also know he needs our help because he requires, as you know, a private sponsor. So if I've got this correctly, your team will do the upfront capital and do some of the project management and some of the things to get things done. But as far as the maintenance, you need a local partner, whether it be a city, village, HOA, someone to take on the maintenance and the long-term prospect. Is that a fair characterization?
That's correct. I kind of talk about the exit strategy.
Okay.
So there's the county natural drainage system, our rivers, streams, wetlands, detention ponds, stormwater. Rain is gonna fall, it's gonna run off, it's gonna go through private lakes, through other systems. And these systems do need to be upgraded. They're not only at their end of life, but they were designed for old rainfall. And we're seeing increased rainfall that is overwhelming our systems. So we're getting funding to create these new systems, but then we wanna walk away and someone else hand them the keys and okay, Clive, I'm gonna let you drive now.
You know what you've seen in like what used to be shopping malls, if they still have them, where the parent has that little tether to the kid that can walk away. We're happy to let you walk away to a point. We're just gonna keep coming back. And
We'll always be a resource.
There you go, that's what I'm trying to say.
And we wanna have partnerships, but not everyone's like Clyde. There's a lot of other people out there like, you're the county, this is your problem, you need to come here and fix it on our property, and that's not how it works. There's property rights, and we respect property rights, and a landowner, like you have your mission that you want a clean lake to enjoy boating, swimming, fishing. Well, what is it where somebody who lives across the street is telling you what you should do with your lake? No, we wanna work together and find that common ground and address the impairments, but also be mindful of what your community wants. And it's not cookie cutter across the county. Every landowner has a different view of what their property, they bought it, they paid for their property. So I will counter one comment you said earlier about the phosphorus though. It's a private lake, but it's public phosphorus. Is that what you said?
It's filled with public phosphorus.
Public phosphorus. Well, where's the phosphorus coming from?
You tell me.
It's coming from all of us,
Me, the public?
I guess. But what
I
everyone.
didn't say government phosphorus.
Whatever. Okay, then you're right.
No, I'm not trying to, no. See, this is a healthy you gotta be able to have these debates here.
So whatever, everyone's flushing their pharmaceuticals and other stuff down the toilet, and then it's the county wastewater treatment plant that's releasing, no, they're treating what everyone's flushing down their
No,
toilet.
I'm not accusing anybody, and you know that, I know that, and so if that's how it came across.
No, phosphorus, it's a challenge, it's coming from a lot of different places. But yeah, no, this is great, I like the slides and the partnerships, and we do wanna continue to work, and these proposals that Michelle talked about, let us hear what you guys wanna do.
Yeah, because, just to kind of wrap this up here, Kurt, because I know you, so our actions to your point about this is working, sorry about the bills. We've identified a full-time ambassador who for the community wants to be that person who can maybe not work for 18 years, but 5 or 6 years, so that would be good. And then you gotta show up and participate. It doesn't happen as a one-off, okay? And, Kurt, just to give Kurt, so he talked about these 319 grants, which are the Illinois EPA grants, if I understand that correctly. And we know that, there's about $130 million who've been awarded through those grants. And like you said, 30's been used, 30 you've got identified, but there's another 70 left, okay? We didn't know this before we started that in our Indian Creek Inlet, we need to do stream bank stabilization, okay? That actually happens to be part of the Des Plaines River Watershed Master Plan. They want that stream bank stabilized. So it was something that was on Kurt's list to do, but he needed a partner like us. So we're trying to figure out, we haven't solved it yet, but what can we do? Where can we get money? How do we work with the private landowner as well as a member? And so together we'll figure it out. But alone, none of us could solve that problem. So, we were trying to have some fun here. Kurt, you did a great job because of all the grants you talked about with Michelle and what she's doing, plus the 319 stuff. But the old Jerry Maguire, show me the money. This is where we wanted Kurt to come back up and say,
Remember I
okay.
said I don't have that big check?
Well, I wanted the old, yeah, that's right. It's all Zelle now. So give him your community address for Zelle and he'll just push it out. But in all seriousness, thank you very much. We just wanted to say that for our association, we all have choices on where we spend our time. We're all volunteers. We all have our own missions and duties depending on what your bylaws and covenants said. For us, our lake is our crown jewel. It's part of a larger ecosystem of water in the community. It ties into everything Kurt's doing. So we've said it makes sense for us to work with local government, whether it be the township or the county. There's value in doing that. Yes, it takes time, but candidly, if we invest the time and we find a way to continue to leverage it year after year, it'll become even more rewarding. So thank you for your time and happy to take any questions.
just real quick, yeah, the HOA case study is a really popular session because you're hearing from, and one of you might be up here next year. So, this is like, peer to peer, and any questions you have for how Clyde's managing the.
Yes, and you are, just state your name in the HOA, just so I have some context.
Bob Kukla, Caroline North, HOA.
Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
How did you work with? Okay, so we have a natural area and we have 3 ponds. Original founders had a great deal of ownership over the development. Last 10 years, we've had so much board turnover that there's no continuity, there's no long-range planning, there's not even short-range planning. Our stewardship company represented here tonight is probably the single factor that's got a continuity from 10 years ago to today. My argument with my board, and I'm not a board member, has been we've turned over the leadership of our community to an outside resource instead of taking ownership ourselves. How did you resolve the short-term board membership and long-range planning?
Fascinating question. So, look, I hear you that I've been on the board 2 years. I would say 5 years ago, Mary, or so, the board at the time brought in an outside management company.
They did.
That lasted about a year. It just proved to be very difficult. Not because of the management committee. I think it had more to do with our processes weren't documented. So how do you have someone come in when nothing's written down? What I will tell you, Bob, is that the reason I think we got proactive and did it is there was a group within the neighborhood who felt that we needed to take back ownership, and that group kind of organized together and put a slate of candidates together and got a fair number of people on the board so that those folks could kind of bring it back. And it took member involvement and people willing to step up and volunteer in order for us to be where we are today. Mary, Allie, what would you add?
Yeah, I think that's right, Clyde. And then to add to that, we do have the lake, our countryside lake. And we've got right now a very strong group of members who are on our lake management committee. And they're working very hard to create a long-term plan, something that you're talking about for the health of our lake and maintaining our lake and improving our lake. So they're working on a plan to try to do that. And we're working through right now, how do we get that plan to stay in perpetuity so it doesn't disappear when we start turning over. So we're trying to find ways to do that. And, do we do it through somehow attaching them to our covenants, getting them recorded in the county records? We're working on things like that, but it's definitely something that we're aware of and trying to work on.
And the only thing I'll add is we had like many of you and Kurt mentioned this in the whole state as well as outside. We had some tough couple days in the summer with the hot weather and the shortened winter with a lot of weeds, and people using the lake were like, my propeller got stuck, kids can't swim. And so, I don't know about you, but we get a handful of members come to the board meetings, I see some head shaking. It's not something that people are just, we've got to have a little bigger than this for on a monthly basis. The point is we put some signs up, and we've done this now 3 times, and we just put a town hall notice. Let's talk lake conditions. And we said, we didn't hide from it. We said, we want to talk. We want to own the issue. We want to hear from what you think, and we're going to adapt together. What do we get? Allie, how many people we get for that? 60, 70 members. Yeah, think about it. And, the interesting thing was they came in all ready to open up and share their thoughts with us. We survived, no visible house guard. But the reality is, what we found was, if we told them what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it, and led with that, they just wanted to know that there was a plan, to your point, and there was some thinking. And yes, we didn't have all the answers, but we needed their help. So communication and transparency and really, investing those town halls has been good for us as well.
We're going to continue doing that for sure.
Other questions? Here and then back there, please.
Hi, I'm Sue with Tangley Oaks. How do you think of your reserve fund? Do you have a formula? X% of your annual expenses need to be factored into us. How do you think of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, candidly, we are gonna be doing a reserve study, at least we're seriously considering it next year, because one hasn't been done for a while. Okay, and to Bob's point is, in order to know if that reserve is right, whether or not we need to continue to build it or do some special thing, it's gonna be driven by the long-term plan. Because we've got a pretty good handle now what it takes to maintain things, but those unknowns, so, some of our critical things in the future, we have a dam. Now we have insurance on that, but that would cost something if there was some repair needed. The lake, dredging is a long-term thing, there's other things, so candidly, we feel like we've got, we don't have any planned expenses to use it, but we are going to be reevaluating that because we know that we want to make sure we're prepared, and what happened down in Florida helps us, have the confidence to say we need to absolutely continue to look at that. Ally, Mary, anything to add?
No, I think you got it, Clyde. Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
hopefully that's helpful. Back there and, I'm sorry.
Good.
Let's go to the phone first.
So there's a question in the chat that says, how have you mandated participation in your HOA and guaranteed your $100 fee?
Okay, so just to clarify, our annual fee is 1,100, not 100, but that's fine. Maybe it's 100 per month. I like that. Now we just raised dues on it. 1,200 for all those out there. Wait, you're 13. But in all fairness to the user, the person on the thing, as far as mandating, so our covenants are very clear that if you're within that 900-acre land that was drawn back in 1928, you don't have a choice, and you cannot opt out unless every single, we can't disband the HOA. So we've got fairly good legal language and protection that the HOA is something that you are. And then, not that we want to do this, but for the handful of times that we've had members who, and I know we've got our attorney back there, or an attorney back there, it's a right of any HOA when you've got members, if they are delinquent over time, you can eventually go down the lien process if you need to as well. But that happens very rarely.
Clyde,
Mary?
one other thing that we do is if we do have people who are delinquent and don't pay their dues, they no longer will have the right to the lake and all of our amenities. So that's another way that,
We suspend privileges for people who are, and for us, it's not delinquent this year. We've got to get into 2 years worth of things before we're going to do something, because we know everybody's got different challenges, and we're not trying to be too stringent, but we want to be fair to those who do. I wish I could ask that person if that addressed it, but if you get follow-up, please let us know, please.
How successful have you been in developing a volunteer component to your residents in doing some of these different things?
Yeah, I would say we have a mixed result, to be honest. When people have passions, they are gonna volunteer every day till Sunday. So we've got a conservation area that we have as part of our community, and there are people who are just absolutely, high on their list to keep the environment, keep the natives, keep that as a walking path, educate. We get people who clean it up, who invest, put a walking path in, that goes pretty well. On the lake, we've got one of our members here, Paul, who is our resident scientist. We call him a chemist. He's great. But in all fairness, it's all volunteer for him. So when we find people, now it's a challenge though, when we want people to do things that wasn't their idea, or when, they didn't, it wasn't something that they're passionate about. So we're working on trying to do a better job with Ally's help here of reaching out and saying, here's what the community has said they want to do, and here's where we need volunteers. And quite candidly, the board is unable to own all the events. We can sponsor it, we can oversee it, but all the hard work and the planning and the execution, we need members otherwise. So we're still figuring that out. Mary,
yeah,
anything to
it's
add?
tough. I think it's very hard to find volunteers right now, like Clyde is saying, and if anybody has ideas or suggestions, we'll certainly be open to them.
I can say too, just to add in, I've only been on the board for a year, and one of the reasons that I joined the board was when Clyde as president and Mary as secretary took over, because of a sort of lead by example, almost like a trickle down. Like they stepped into a board that had unfortunately become a little contentious. They had sort of damaged relationships in the community and with various different, government agencies, and things, which is just sad, but where I've found my inspiration to step in and help specifically with some of these issues, even though people are real quick to tell you you're crazy, but is from this leadership. And actually, to your question as well, I was thinking about that, it's by these invested volunteers. So it's with volunteers that feel passionate and have a good idea and truthfully, lead by example that this is a collective issue and we need to come together. So I think part of what the three of us have talked about to try to do is to kind of try to harness that to then sort of, spark interest from people. But yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to do.
I'm not saying this is perfect, but one thing we've also learned, and I'm sure many of you have done this in your personal and professional lives, but we believe very much in convening. And we convene to try and make sure we all understand the issue and that we all have the same definition of the problem. Because oftentimes we find we spend a lot of time when what Mary thinks is the issue is different than Ally and me, and it's hard to solve. So our goal is to bring people together. We've had other town halls besides the lake, on a property dispute we did about some natives, and we bring people, let's define the issue. What are people, and once we get common agreement, okay, now let's all work together to solve it. So now we kind of flip from being contentious to, how do we work together? So we have found that our outreach, and when we put time in and convene and listen, it does help. Now, it's not perfect in every situation, but that's one of the things we're trying to do better because our members want transparency. And so we're trying to give it to them, but we'll see. Who else had a question? Please, Loch Lomond.
Tom Casey, Loch Lomond. One comment and one question. The comment goes back to the phosphorus.
Yes.
Question, comments from earlier. What we found when we dug into it a little bit, because everybody was blaming the farmers and everything around us, right, and everybody else but us that live in the neighborhood, that 60% of our water, between 50 and 60% of the water that came into our lake came from our neighborhood. Which means that stuff came from people putting it on their lawns or the lawn service that they were using. So we had to educate a number of people on that.
Absolutely.
I think that's gonna help. But my question is more how you're balancing your spraying versus your weed harvesting, which I believe you're doing, because we're doing something very similar.
Yeah, it's a great question. Paul, you want to take that one? You want me to?
Well,
It's up to you.
How are we balancing the hybrid approach? So we're probably gonna do we've been using harvesters. We use harvesters exclusively in 2023. Our curly leaf is our big enemy on that. And we were moderately successful in 2023. Didn't go so well at the beginning of the year, but we kind of caught up with it. In 2024, it came back with a vengeance. We got a late start with the harvesters, and then we switched over to using some chemicals. We specifically use C-Pro's C-Clear, which is chelated copper, just copper with a phoslock in it. So it's killing the algae bloom and then simultaneously grabbing up the phosphorus so it can't lead to a sequential, phosphorus bloom from the decaying algae. Next year we're gonna hit it in the spring with either galleon or sonar or something like that, and hit that curly leaf really early. And we're using a ILM right now as our application contractor and advisor. We also have an outside consultant we use, and expert consultant, and we just gather information from everywhere we can, and we try and do the best we can. But that, ultimately, we need to attack phosphorus if we ever are gonna really have an impact, because the short term, every year, just doing the same thing every year, that'll go on for eternity if we don't deal with phosphorus at some point.
Can I answer that, Paul?
Sure.
Yeah, so also one of the things that our LIM committee, our Lake Improvement Management Committee, is doing is they're looking at doing studies to determine exactly where our phosphorus is, how much is in our water, how much is in our sediment, how much is coming in. So that's part of how they're gonna balance how they do the hybrid. Are we out of time?
No, we're good. We'll take one more, but just to wrap this up, I think.
Okay.
This is a great discussion, so yeah, if there's more questions for
Oh.
the Countryside Lakes, please.
Okay, I was just gonna say, so we know Paul and the team on the lake committee have identified 36 points of entry for water into our lake. The biggest is the inlet. That's 80% of the stuff coming in from there. We also know, because of Alana's help though, that, in addition to rainwater coming in, we've got shorelines that contributed to. And so we're trying to, the image we're trying to create for our members is, if we're going to fix this lake, and fix is probably a bad word, but try and improve its health for the long term, for the next generation, is if we can first plug the hole in the boat and get all the stabilization and phosphorus locked up, then we can think about maybe some spot dredging, then we can think about doing some longer term things. But if we're gonna spend, money doing things that, the moment you bail out, more water's coming in, you've got that same issue. I think you guys know that well. So Paul, are we talking with Loch Lomond on a regular basis?
No, but we'd like to.
Okay, we're gonna connect these two. Who else has a question? Thank you.
Anything on chat? All right,
We
Clyde,
should-
thank you, sir. Thank you, Countryside Lakes. Now we keep the free legal advice to the end. That's what I meant to say. So I'd like to introduce Brian Lynch with the Law Office of Brian Lynch. He's going to talk about understanding drainage easements, and I touched on that earlier. I do really mean it when I say property owners have rights, and for us to tell a property owner what you should do with your land, we're not going to do that. We're going to work together. And these easements are a way that could provide some additional rights for maintenance and for other uses, but just understanding easements, we want to have this is 101 or 201, but
101. 101, that's a fair statement.
All right, so thank you, Brian.
Appreciate Kurt, Shereen for giving me the opportunity to speak with everybody tonight. And I'm sure everybody here is super riveted to hear at the end of the night from an attorney talk about easements. I can't imagine what would be more exciting. Just kind of putting in a frame of reference what you're talking about when you're talking about easements. There's a variety of different ways you can acquire property rights, and one is a deed, which is the conveyance of all the rights potentially that a person has. Or you can have a license agreement, which is the conveyance of a use. It's like a privilege. And then you have an easement, which is the conveyance of certain rights. And when you're looking at easements, trying to just focus the discussion a little bit more on the drainage, because I think that's what I've been informed that you guys are most interested in, but I think it's helpful to understand the context of easements in general. An easement is a property right. It's not the full bevy of rights that you might get, but it's some. And people oftentimes look at and say to me, what should be in an easement or what can be an easement? It's really what two parties can agree to. There's no right and wrong. There's a couple things that I think that you have to start out with and understand and what you're looking to do. And you have an easement that could be an easement of pertinence. And that's an easement where you have two pieces of property that might be adjacent to one another. And in that situation, you have a dominant estate, and then you have a servient estate. Dominant estate is the one that has the benefit of using the servient estate's property. That might be a cross-access easement agreement or a driveway agreement, where you're cutting through another person's property to gain access to your property. Your property being the dominant estate or the benefited estate, and the person or the owner that you're cutting through their property, they are the servient or the burden property. That's one type of easement. Another easement, which is going to fall right more akin to what you're talking about when you're talking about drainage easement, might be a easement in gross, where you don't have to have an adjacent property. You just have to have a right in somebody else's property. That might be like a utility easement. A utility company doesn't necessarily own land next to yours, but they may have an easement that runs through the entirety of a subdivision in the rear 10 feet. And that's an example. And then when you get into easements, you have temporary easements and you have permanent easements. I'm guessing most of the easements that would be falling into the camp of drainage are going to be permanent easements, because you're not looking for a temporary fix. You're looking for a more long-term solution to handle the sheet runoff or to manage the storm runoff that's generated by the roadways or adjacent properties or lower lying areas. When you're looking at easements in general, there's a variety of ways easements can come about. They can come about through a deed where somebody gives an easement in a deed, or they give a deed, but they retain rights to the property. That would be an example, or a platted subdivision where you've got certain areas that might be called out as a detention area or a retention area or a utility area. I would anticipate that the drainage easements that are relevant to everyone in this room are more likely not came to life through a platted subdivision, where it's already in the document. A platted subdivision is, in essence, it's kind of like a deed. When the first person, the developer, comes about and takes that land, they develop it and they'll have the authority to have all of the property in there and designate what property they want for the roadways, for the detention, for the utilities. And then when they subsequently sell off portions of that property to other people, those people are taking subject to those easements. So they don't have a right because it's already recorded on the platted subdivision. And when they're acquiring title or ownership through their deed, they are taking that deed subject to those rights. You can't really force, the other way to do it is by operation of law, but I don't really think that they could apply to an older area that is residential or homeowner association that's been around for a long time. And through the course of custom, let's say everybody's cutting through this vacant piece of property to get to a lake, and they're cutting through this property, and that's been happening for decades. That might be an easement by prescription, where the course of custom it's been going on for so long that it exists. But drainage easements typically are going to be something that you're going to see arise by way of a platted subdivision, where there's an intention to have that in existence. You may have to have one later on come about because you've got a problem you're trying to address for unseen circumstances. And so when you're talking about those easements or the drainage easements, you really want to be looking at two areas that you want to be, maybe three areas you want to be identifying. Who are the parties to that easement? What area of the property is subject to that easement? Because you don't have, typically a blanket easement is across a whole area. Though that's extremely rare, especially in some area that has already been developed. You almost never see blanket easements. Blanket easements come about in the very inception of a development where somebody doesn't know where the roads are going to be, doesn't know where the closed culverts are going to be, doesn't know where the lighting's going to be. So they lay all that out and they're giving themselves a blanket easement. So I wouldn't think that that would be happening for most of the people in this room. It's probably going to be through the platted subdivision and not an easement that's going to rise by way of prescription. So you're going to have the area that's designated to be burdened by the easement. You're going to have the parties to that easement, and then you're going to say what can be done in that easement. So the third thing is what can be done. It's not an easement. An example might be when you're looking at an easement, you might say, all right, I deal with like maybe some pipeline cases where they may have an easement to put a 24-inch pipe through the property to convey the natural gas. Now they want to come in and then put a 36-inch pipe. Well, they don't have the authority to put in a 36-inch pipe. They've got the authority to maintain the 24-inch pipe that they've got, but they don't have 36. Why? Because that's not the easement right that they've gotten. So when you're crafting your drainage easements, you want to be as forward thinking as you can, but you don't want to be excessive. You want to be reasonable. Everybody, I think, understands what fairness is and what fairness should be. And so when you say, all right, like you don't want to be excessive, taking future rights that may come into play 50 years down the road, that wouldn't necessarily be reasonable. So what area is affected, what you're planning to do in that area, and who the parties, who has the right to use it. An example might be like a gas easement. If there's a gas easement, an electric company wouldn't have the right to run their lines in that area, nor would a telecommunication company or anybody else. Why? Because it's just a gas easement. It was entered into between the gas company and the subdivision when it was first created, or perhaps maybe it was more narrow in terms of its scope, and it was only a handful of property owners. It would just be those property owners and that gas company that would have the easement. Most of the time easements are recorded and then they run with the land. So it's might be the parties now or their successor entities. A company comes in and buys out a gas company or buys out a telecommunication company. They have those rights because they acquired those rights, just like a subsequent homeowner would have the burden of that easement or potentially the benefit of that easement. One thing that Kurt had mentioned, when you're valuing, it doesn't really matter what you're taking. If you're taking a piece of the property in fee simple, if you're taking a temporary construction easement, or if you're taking a permanent easement, there's a certain methodology that you have to go through when you're valuing it, and that doesn't really change at all based upon the property rights. And the first step is when you value it, you have to value the whole piece of property. And you might say, well, that's kind of crazy. We're just looking to take an easement. Well, you have to know what the whole is before you can start deducing out what the value of that piece of the property is. So you have to understand what the whole piece of property is, looking at its highest and best use. You could look at a piece of property, let's say it's an ag piece of property or a vacant residential. You say, oh, it's vacant residential, so I'm just going to value it as a vacant piece of land. Well, no, because it has the potential, the highest and best use, to be developed as a residential property. So even though if you don't value it as it has a home on it, you still value it as consistent with residential vacant land, but you value it according to its zoning classification or its highest and best use in zoning classification, meaning that if, let's say it's an ag piece of property, but it could be everything around it's been developed and it's residential, you wouldn't be restricted to say, oh, this just has ag value. No, you'd be able to say, is it likely that this could be ultimately subdivided and sold off as residential? If so, you look at it as a residential valuation. So the first thing is you value the whole under its highest and best use, not its current use. Then the second thing is you look at the value of the area that you want to impress the easement in before it's impressed, and you say what the value is to that. And most of the time, you're going to probably need to get an appraiser, some real estate professional. I would suggest a real estate appraiser to look at it, to value the area that you're impressing with an easement before it's impressed, and then you look at the value of that same area after the easement's impressed, and the difference between those two values is the compensation that the property owner is entitled to for that easement. Now, it doesn't happen a ton, but it certainly can. And an example might be, let's say you've got 3 acres and you want to run, and you got 3 acres, they're all stacked next to each other, and you're running right through the middle of those 3 acres a drainage easement. And that in the terms of the drainage easement say, hey, you can't build on that drainage easement, you can't put anything on it. But the municipality maybe has, or the township or county has a restriction that says each lot is developed in this area can only be so big. They have a minimum lot requirement. If that drainage easement affects that, you may render the balance of that property undevelopable, and that's a damage. And so to the extent that damage arises, the property owner is entitled to that. Now, why? Because in that example, those 3 acres can't be put to any residential development. Why? Because an easement is running through them and it renders them useless, open space. And that might be perfectly fine. Everybody can agree to it. If that's what the parties agree to, there's no problem. But when you're valuing it and you're talking about going through fairness, you have to look at and say, all right, what effect, and that's when you talk about diminution or damage, what effect does the easement have on the property that I continue to own after it's impressed? And ascribing a value to that isn't something that I can do as a lawyer, and presumably anybody can do in the government or in this room. It would be an appraiser that would come in. And so that's what you look at and say, you may have a value, and the property owner might say, I'm not interested in getting the full value. This is a betterment for the community. This is a betterment where I have a house. These are vacant lots that I wasn't going to develop in my example. So you can find a different way to address those issues without being rigid. And it's about coming to an agreement, trying to find a way to reach an agreement. I always take the approach, and anytime I'm dealing with, the primary focus of my firm is condemnation, representing property owners against government agencies, the tollway, IDOT, Lake County DOT, McHenry County DOT, all the various municipalities. But I always look at it and say, it's not about frustrating the project, it's about just making sure that everybody is comfortable and understands what's going on and understands what the proper valuations are. And sometimes there might be a difference of opinion, but most of the time, everybody benefits from trying to find a way to reach an agreement in the process that you're pursuing. So nobody, I don't think that would, any association that would need a drainage easement would want to go about getting a drainage easement because they think it's a great, fun thing to do. They're doing it because they're trying to address a larger problem. And so that's the kind of the valuation approach to it. You know, I touched on this a little bit before. Some of the considerations might be, let's say you're taking a large area, but really you're only going to be for a drainage easement, or you need a large area, but there's really only going to be some infrastructure in a particular area within that easement, and the balance of that easement area, the homeowner could never develop it, couldn't do anything with it, because let's say it's a depressional area or it's a wetland or something. Well, then in that situation, I don't think the valuation is going to be as high, because why? They couldn't do anything with it. Ultimately, regardless of the easement, there are going to be some limitations that are there. So all of those things factor in. That's a consideration. Going forward, who's going to maintain the easement? Normally in a situation where you're dealing with a dominant estate and a serving estate, the benefited estate or the burdened estate, the benefited estate or the dominant estate has the obligation for maintenance. Why? Because they're the ones that are benefiting from it. So typically the law will look at and say that the benefited estate has the burden. However, it comes down to, again, to what two parties can agree to. So to the extent that two parties agree that they're going to share these costs 50-50, that's completely acceptable, as well as the property owner serving the state taking on the financial obligation to do that. So that's not an issue. And then you're going to be looking at, I dealt with some easements where an entity takes it, but they also want to take the right to have the ability to convey it to third parties. If that's the case, then I think that may affect valuation. If they're just going to be taking it and they're going to have extremely limited use, then that probably wouldn't influence the valuation side of it. And then when you kind of drift over into the area of common challenges, and I know that associations, you can run into people with differing viewpoints about how things should be done and if you can reach an agreement and pushback. And if you have an easement already, then there's very little that I think that the property owner, that their property is subject to the easement, can do or say, because the easements run with the land. You can't disregard an easement. You have to adhere to it. It's a property right. It's an enforceable property right. So if you're the benefited estate or you're the association and you've got a drainage easement, you can enforce those rights. Do you ever want to go there? No, because getting litigious or having you enforce things, I think is a destructive process. I think that nobody, and at the end of the day, they spend a lot of money and you might wind up getting some satisfaction at the end, but there's a lot of cost and anxiety and frustration involved. So when you're going about that, I think it's important to try to find a way to reach an agreement. But if to the extent that you've got a challenge, you just take a look and say, all right, well, what were we given? Are we exceeding those rights that we were given? Are we exceeding those rights because of the area, because of the activity? Or is somebody trying to exercise those rights that don't have the rights that were conveyed in the original grant of easement? And those are the things I think when you're looking at it, or you're overburdening an easement. An example for drainage, it's hard to kind of think, because the drainage is going to be, most of the time, it's going to be an operational situation with regard to Mother Nature, and you're not going to be saying, oh, if an example could be, I guess, if you had a subdivision and now this subdivision wanted to be able to tap into a drainage easement in an adjacent subdivision, and that original subdivision did not ever have an agreement or any sort of relationship with this adjacent one, then the adjacent one wants to come in and utilize the drainage easement or have their sheet runoff go into your lake, that wouldn't be something that would be proper, provided that it's not falling under the riparian rights and your lower grade. And that's a whole nother area of law that you can get into. But when you're talking about easements, do they have the right to use that easement? So that'd be an example of further burdening an easement. When you look at further burdening, you always look at and say, what was the grant of the original area? An example might be, let's say you've got 2 acres and then you subdivide it and there's only two homeowners in those 2 acres, and then they tear the houses down and they subdivide it, and now there's 8 houses in those 2 acres. And you might say, well, now we're taking on more water, that's a greater burden. Well, it's the same area. Though the law is going to look at it and say that's the same area, we don't want to limit the productivity of this land. But to the extent that they're doing something different, that would be a problem. And this may not necessarily apply. Let's say you had like a walking path in an area in a homeowners association, and somebody came in and they said, oh, we're going to make this now a walking and a bike path. Well, if the easement originally was only for a walking path, you can't expand it to include a bike path. And there's cases out there, and I won't get into all those because I'm sure the last thing anyone here wants to hear about is a case that they're going to try to write down and research. But it's very clear when you're talking about further burdening an easement. If it's a gas, the electricity company can't come in because that would be further burdening, and that wasn't the original intent. And then the last thing I guess I would touch on is when you're trying to draft the, obviously, I presume that any association is going to be working with an attorney, not that, you know, attorneys come down from man on high. They're the same as everybody else, every other occupation. But what they do is they're understanding what has to be drafted in an agreement to make it enforceable so that it is something that the associations can rely upon. You always want to make sure, obviously, that you're identifying the area. You don't necessarily have to have a legal description. A legal description of the area burdened by the easement is a good idea, but you don't always have to have a legal description. You can have it in a document, like a survey that calls it out. You want to make sure, as I said before, the parties are identified, who has the right to use it. And it's going to run with the land. It should be recorded, because you always want to record. That's when you record something, you're giving notice to the world. So if somebody sells their property and they say, and a buyer says, I didn't know about that. That didn't appear on my title report. Well, it didn't appear in your title report if it wasn't recorded. So if you have an easement, you should always record the easement from an association standpoint. And sometimes you're going to have to record it if it's not something that came about when the association or subdivision was originally created. You subsequently would have to should record it, and you'd have to go about recording it against every parcel in that association, to the extent that every parcel in that association is burdened by that easement in some respect. So I've walked through a lot of different points. It sounds like I'm expecting, but maybe there won't be. Questions that you guys might have about easements and about, you know, your associations?
You kind of covered it when you were just saying about on how I can understand like the covenants that the homeowners association have, the protocols and the capabilities of making the amendments to the covenants that would be probably dealing with those easements that were originally drafted and surveyed in order to prepare for the development and establishment of the you know, your areas that your homeowners association is covering. And so my point is, out of your explanations here, I would expect then that each and every one of us as homeowner association members would be considering on how, if there's some kind of work in drainage or whatever, stormwater drainage, or even other covenants of gas lines being brought in, okay? Who's the dominant, who's the servant type arrangement, okay? Couldn't we as homeowner associations require that as an example through our own negotiations with, say, the gas company, and how they would be changing the distribution of whatever the product is to wherever the location is they care to give? Wouldn't it be best that homeowner associations could maybe cash in on such things and negotiate some kind of a an agreement that if they do run it through their easement areas, okay, that they're gonna receive some kind of an annual payback.
You could try, I mean, utilities, like, one thing might be like a telecommunication, you see the large cell towers. A lot of these things have been monetized, you have large, like, companies coming in just buying cell towers that have nothing to do with cell tower service. And they're just buying the cell towers because the revenue that those things throw off is pretty substantial. And so they buy those towers and then they lease it out to AT&T, to Mobile, to whomever, Verizon, to put on their equipment on there, and they get the revenue stream. But the homeowner, and this is going back, they get an easement to put the cell tower, but when they sign that original easement, you have to look at the language. Does that easement allow that company to convey those rights to third parties, to Verizon, to Mobile, T-Mobile, to all those other entities? So going to the gas company, a lot of times the gas company, they kind of have a lot of say. Like, I dealt with some properties where they say, oh, we're going to run this, we want to run the gas line right through the property. And my client, they already had a gas line. I'm like, well, the gas line isn't for us, it's to serve the adjacent property. So in that situation,
they're gonna make a profit from such a.
In that situation, they're not gonna be in the mind to say you're gonna be able to get an annual royalty or dividend or anything, but you might be able to negotiate out some level of compensation but in that situation, you don't have any obligation to agree with them. But as far as generally with an easement in the association, I think that you guys have, if you're gonna alter an easement that affects other parties, you generally have to have 100% buy-in. It's like if you're gonna change a declaration in an association, you have to have almost unanimity in agreement of what you're gonna do, which sometimes can be very hard. There might be the easement, the drainage easement might only have to go through a handful of properties. It may not be everybody. So it might just be the negotiation and discussions with a couple property owners and not everybody. Just because it benefits everybody doesn't mean that you have to incorporate everybody into the discussion.
Brian, I have a question. You talked about course of custom. So what I understood that to mean is something that has been going on for so long that it becomes acceptable, and you use that vacant lot, people might be traversing it to get to a lake. Is there an opposite of that? Like, is there an abandonment of an easement? So if there would be an easement that has never been used and the requirements for that easement are not being met, does the easement go away?
Easements can expire if there's an abandonment of it. And you all have to look at the facts. There's not any bright line law that says if you have an easement and you haven't exercised your rights to that easement, it expires after X number of years. You look at the facts of what might be happening. I was dealing with a case in Indiana where a property owner that I represented, the South Bend was taking a strip of land and they named them in a lawsuit, but they also named the railroad. Well, the railroad had an old easement in there for them to lay a set of tracks, but they had never used it. When you're dealing with like entities, like you can't ever have an abandonment with a government agency. Their rights never expire. And the railroad is pretty on par with the government. I mean, the railroad, they have their own surface transportation board. They have their own court system in this country. Railroads are extremely powerful. But in terms of when you're going and you're talking about an abandonment, you have to look at the facts. If you've got an easement and you've never exercised any of your rights, never exerted any dominance, never occupied it, I tend to think, and it's happened like not over like 5 years, I think it would have to be probably over maybe 10 years or something like that. Then I think you start getting to the point of saying this easement has been either, let's say there's no maintenance, they're neglecting it, they're not occupying it, they're not using it, or there's no longer a purpose for it because now it once provided access, but now we have this other access point, and so it becomes obsolete. Just because, like an example would be an easement by necessity. You have two parcels of land, and the one guy owns both pieces of property, and he sells off this piece, but this is the only piece that has frontage on the road. So an easement by necessity would be like, well, you can't use this unless it has access to the road, because let's say this piece up here is landlocked. But now let's say 30 years late, so he's got an easement by necessity to go through this southern piece of property. But now let's say they build a road adjacent over here, and now this piece of property can get a driveway or access point. That would go away. Why? Because it's no longer necessary. And so why burden this property to give this property access when this property can gain access without any burden to this property? You might prefer this access, but that's not really the issue. The issue isn't preference, the issue is necessity.
So building on that, if I could, is an easement a single entity? In other words, let's say an easement has like 6 attributes to it. And, 4 of them continue to have a purpose and a need, but 2 of them have been outlived or not used. Can you modify or abandon a part of an easement, or is it all or nothing?
I think you could probably narrow down the scope of the easement, if I understand your question correctly. If let's say you have the right to do, generally easements don't have to enumerate out exactly what the rights are that the dominant estate has. To the extent that they do, if there hasn't been any exercising of those easement rights over the course of a significant period of time, I would think that you would have a very strong argument to say that those have been abandoned or withered away, or the entity no longer holds those rights. But then you kind of fall into the camp. The reality is, well, how do you enforce that? How do you go and say, oh, you've lost these rights? And that's where you kind of maybe the party's going to agree, but you'd have to almost go to court to get a declaration or a decision from a court, which to the extent, if it's super problematic for an association, it could be worthwhile, but it all depends again upon the facts and what are you hoping to gain? What's the goal? What are you going to gain? And what's it going to cost you to get that gain, the cost benefit?
Thank you.
You touched on it earlier. This isn't necessarily easement per se, but you touched on, I've read about that case law has established that if I have land up here, I get to flood land below me, or I get to pass my water down to the land below me. Can you comment on that regarding drainage?
I mean, the land that's below other land on the natural concourse of land, the land below under riparian rights, the higher land has the right to shed its water into the lower area. But I don't think that you're able to enhance or increase that flow. There's a riparian, it's a whole body of law, but on a very general level, higher properties are allowed to shed its water onto the lower lying property.
And that's not an easement then?
No, that wouldn't be an easement. That's just riparian rights. Because an easement is going to be more of a defined area. And so unless if you're a higher piece of property, the water that's coming off of your property would just be going wherever, right? It wouldn't be necessarily being channeled. You wouldn't be creating a culvert on your property and directing all the water off of your property to go to the lower property. That wouldn't be consistent with riparian rights, because in that situation, you're creating a bit more of a man-made influence and the kind of flow of the water.
Can I expand on that? Like, I was thinking as you were talking about stormwater drains and within our subdivision, but another subdivision says, hey, I'm going to direct my water into your stormwater drain system and overburden your stormwater. Is that an example of an easement, or is that a riparian right? Where does that fall?
It wouldn't be an easement right, and to the extent it would be, I mean, right. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a riparian right either. I would say that would be an improper burdening of your guys' system. I mean, I see that Illinois Department of Transportation, when you deal with water volumes, it's incredibly complicated because you have to get engineers. You just can't go in and say this is happening and it's a problem. You have to be able to say this is the problem and here's the data to show that it's a problem. So you have to be able to establish it, and you get, there's stormwater engineers. I'm sure you guys are well aware of how complex it can be, and then you're not just dealing with this area, you're dealing with what is the entire area that your system is designed for, and what's the entire area now that's being shed into your system. So it gets pretty, and those engineers are unfortunately very expensive. But it wouldn't be an easement issue, and I don't think it would be a right parent. I think it would just be basically a property rights issue.
Just have a quick question. A couple of years back, we had the world's favorite telecommunications company come into our subdivision and dig it up to put in their new fiber optic cable. The homeowners had in the past put in nice little bushes and plants around the boxes so that they weren't visible, etc. And those got completely destroyed, and whole sections of our landscaping also got destroyed. My question is, they have the legal right to do so, to put in their cable in the easement. Do we have the right to have them repair everything to the standards it was before they started?
You look at, again, you go back to the easement agreement. If there's no restoration provision that's provided in there, and a lot of times I'll see class subdivision that'll say that they have all these rights. You can't put a fence, you can't put any landscaping, or you can't build any structures on it, but you could put landscaping. But if you do so, they have the right to come in and cut it down, and it's at your own expense if you want to replace it. That's very common language. So I would look at the easement agreement, because if they say they're coming in, all right, fine, they're coming in.
They don't say that they're anything at all. They just come in.
I mean, again, you have to look at what's giving them the right to come in. Presumably, there's some underlying easement agreement that they've got. And sometimes there might be a recorded agreement, or it could just simply be, words and notations on a larger plat that's done by leaders. And you probably, if you look at it, you'll see like their lines that ended with an arrow on it, and they'll point and they'll say utility easement within these dashed lines or something. And that's where it's at. So either by monumentation, by notation words, or by symbols on those surveys or on those plats. And then oftentimes in those documents, some fine print in the bottom of it, it'll say the parties to it, what they can do, what the homeowners that subsequently come into there are prohibited from doing and may do. And so many of them say, you can't put any fencing or anything like that. And if we have to do anything come in, we can cut down all of your trees and they prune them back, but obviously they go in very aggressively. And so the restoration, and sometimes they may provide a restoration provision. So if you're a homeowner association,
so
that's something
the subdivision plat.
Yeah, the subdivision plat would be, I tend to think if you're in a subdivision, the subdivision plat would be the kind of the Bible or the gospel of what easements exist within there. And then if it's not in there, and then you go to your title, and if it's not, and that should be also captured on your title commitment. And if it's not in your title commitment, they don't have any rights. So, I mean, and it's not uncommon. People say, oh, I've got an easement by, right or by use. That's very loose and comes down to facts. I think that's very, very difficult sometimes to establish, but if they've been doing it for 20 years, 30 years, then there's some validity to it.
I appreciate that last point, because about the same time frame that you were commenting on, I think the same company tried to do the same thing in my neighborhood. And I am knowledgeable enough. I pulled up the plat of survey, I pulled up my title. There were no easements in the fine print or any type of marking. And they tried to put something along the back line of the properties. And
that's what you need to do.
Fight about doing that and not doing that. Now, I own double lots, and on one of them, I managed to stop them from doing that because I told them, you know, we'd have a different conversation if they could prove to me that there was an easement of which, you know, I had no documentation. But on the other lot, which is adjacent to it, there's already a telephone pole and a bunch of telephone lines going back down. And so would that be a case of there's a pre-existing, I mean, that's a telephone line, not a fiber
It could be
optic
some,
line.
I mean, sometimes,
Is that
like-
the pre-existing thing that you were talking
yeah,
about?
it could be, but I mean, on if there's a telephone line, even like cell phone companies or electric companies, they can't just say like, oh, I'm gonna come in on your property and put a telephone pole or put an electrical pole because we've gotta run it electric to this neighbor over. They can't do it.
They
The
just
only
wanted
way-
to use the existing thing, but it was a different company.
Even if they want it, unless somehow that they're a successor entity where they acquired all of the interest in the original one, they wouldn't have the authority unless there's, like, just because it's an electrical easement doesn't necessarily, you gotta look at the parties who were originally involved, and unless the successor entity somehow, or the entity that's attempting to do the work is somehow a successor entity of the original one, if they are, then they have the authority. If they're not, they're not a party to it, and then they don't have any of those easement rights, but many times they will come in and they'll try to push their way. I've seen entities comment specifically where they've come in and said, oh, we're gonna put a pole, we're gonna do this work because we got to run electrical over here, and if you want electric service, you're gonna allow us, right? Well, no, because they don't have the right to do that, and that's inconsistent with the rights that they had. So the clients I've had in that situation would just say no, but you know, many times it's like, well, how much do you wanna fight? But they can't just come on your property, and sometimes, you know, sheriffs or police departments are reluctant because they'll view it as a private dispute, so they're reluctant to get involved. But if the entity doesn't have an easement, you would like to think that they should be willing, the police that is, be willing to step forward and say, until you demonstrate that you've got it, prove it.
There's a few questions in the chat. Someone asked, often people place storage sheds or lots on an easement designed for drainage. What can an HOA do to prevent this issue or resolve it?
Sure. I mean, there's as I said before, it's about communicating and trying to make sure, but if there's a drainage easement and impairing the functionality of that drainage easement, then those things, I think the association would have 100% the right to issue kind of some sort of cease and desist letter to say, move this. Ultimately, if they are impeding it and they're not willing to move it, it comes down to, and you know, people can't reach an agreement, it comes down to trying to have it to force them to abide by the use of the easement, and the association may have to end up taking legal action, which would be obviously unfortunate, because something like that, you know, maybe you've got some provision in the bylaws that allow you to push those costs and those expenses back on the reluctant property owner, and then that kind of helps level the playing field. But for that, it's very difficult for the associations to shoulder, you know, those legal expenses.
Another question, I'm not sure if you're able to speak on this, but someone asked, any guidance legally how an HOA can ensure realtors and title companies recognize the HOA at closing?
Well, if they're,
It's a state law.
you have to do, I mean, because if it's an HOA, they have something recorded against title. And so before you can close, if a property's within an association, they have to issue a paid assessment letter and everything. And without that, the title company absolutely should not be issuing a title. They shouldn't be involved. I would think you don't have to go to a title company. Yeah, you could take a deed from somebody on the corner of the street if you wanted to. Why do people go to the title company? Because you want title insurance. What's title insurance? To ensure that the person that you're buying the property from owns the property. Is it, in this day and age, does that happen too often? The person you're buying the property from isn't entitled? I don't think so, but maybe 200 years ago in Nebraska, maybe that happened more. I don't know. But that's the function of title insurance. But beyond that, though, I don't think title insurance does a whole lot to help property owners. But they should, that association shouldn't have a problem. And if they know of a closing, if they sent the letter, I would think, to the title company, because title companies are super risk adverse because they're providing insurance. They're very risk averse. And if they say, you can't do this, they're not gonna say, well, let's go ahead and do it anyways. They're gonna say, hey, I gotta be told what to do. If you guys can't agree, the court needs to tell me what to do. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Brian. So, you all passed easement 101.
Maybe 102.
It was a little more advanced, but at least now you'll appreciate the property rights and how easements function. And for those of you that are gonna go and stay up all night and get your proposal in by 2 p.m. tomorrow, Michelle, we sometimes receive these great proposals, these great ideas on other people's land.
Oh, no.
Oh, gosh.
And we've taken the bait sometimes.
Oh, no.
And then finding out later that I don't want that on my property, no one told me about it, then there's gonna be no project. So, we call it land rights in our policy. And when we receive a proposal, and whatever, it's a bioswale, rain garden, stream restoration, is it actually their property? Is it the HOA's property? Is it the landowner's property? We're gonna check that. And if it's not, it doesn't mean that we throw the proposal in the garbage, but we ask the question is, do you have an easement? Or can you get an easement? Or can we talk with the other landowner and figure out how to obtain that land right to make this project actually move forward? So that's that's 101 level. Okay? If you don't own the land and you wanna do a project on somebody else's land, let's get an easement. Right? So, yeah, that was, the end of the workshop. Thanks for everyone staying late. We'll hang out if there's any follow-up questions, but, Shireen, yes, thank you for putting this on, Shireen. Yeah, appreciate you coming out. We'll have this, information recorded and available. I thought this was very good, and thank you again. Have a good night.